let's talk about the AP Psych test a little bit. So, as you probably know by now, the AP Psych test is split into two parts. You have 100 multiple choice questions worth 2/3 of the test, and then you have 2 free response questions worth 1/3 of the test. And one FRQ is going to be a concept application FRQ, meaning they can pull terms from any unit. And the other FRQ is going to be predominantly research design or research method based, meaning that they're going to have terms or questions dealing with things like, hey, what's the hypothesis in this study? What's the independent variable? Is this an experiment, random assignment, correlations, all that type of stuff. So the second FRQ, the research design FRQ, will be predominantly, if not all, research design based. And with that said, sometimes they do pull terms from other units for that second FRQ. We're going to start out with a bonus term, and that is the serial position effect. So we're not even to the top 100 terms here. We got the serial position effect to kick us off, which says that people are more likely to recall the first and last information from a memorized list rather than the information in the middle. So for example, let's say that for whatever reason you don't have your phone and your parents are like, hey, we need you to go to the grocery store, and for some reason you can't write stuff down, and they give you a list of things to get at the grocery store. You're more likely to recall the information at the beginning and end of the list rather than the stuff in the middle. Another example might be if someone is studying the day before a test, they are more likely to recall the next day the things they studied at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day rather than the stuff in the middle. And related to this is the term the primacy effect, which is where people are more likely to recall items at the beginning of a memorized list, just the beginning. And then you also have the recency effect, which says that people are more likely to recall items at the end of a memorized list. Closure, a Gestalt psychology term. As you all-stars will probably remember, Gestalt psychology says that we tend to see organized patterns or the whole rather than bits and pieces that make up those patterns. So according to the APA, closure can be defined as when people tend to perceive incomplete forms as complete. In other words, our brains tend to fill in the missing parts so as to perceive the stimulus as the whole. So right here, you're looking at, most of you are probably perceiving a triangle, when in reality, that triangle does not exist. Our brains are filling the gap there due to the process of closure. All that really exists in this picture are these 3 weird Pac-Man shapes. However, our brain fills in the gaps there with closure. Here's another example of closure. We have these pentagon shapes, but most of us are probably going to see a soccer ball because our brains are filling in the gap. And moving on to term 99, we have proximity, another Gestalt psychology term. And proximity occurs when elements are placed close together. And as a result, we tend to perceive them as part of a group. So as you can see over here, the image on the left, these squares have no proximity, but the squares on the right do. Okay, that's proximity. Here's another example of proximity. Instead of seeing 6 individual lines, we tend to see 3 pairs of 2 columns due to the closeness of each of those pairs. So that's proximity. That's another Gestalt psychology term. At number 98, we have the figure ground, okay? So the figure in an image is the focal point of the image. So in this case, the figure is going to be the tree. That is the figure. That is the focal point of this image. And then we have the ground, which is the background. So not only is the ground just the ground here, but it's also the sky and everything else that isn't the focal point, and everything else that isn't the tree. So the ground is everything that's not the focal point. Now, sometimes the figure and ground can become ambiguous. And we have a classic illusion here. This is the face and vase illusion. And it depends on what you are focusing on. It depends on what the focal point is for you to know what the figure or ground is. So if you're looking at the black vase here in the middle, that becomes the figure, while everything surrounding it becomes the ground. Or if you're looking at the faces looking at each other, okay, those faces become the figure or the focal point, while the vase becomes the ground. At number 97, we have the reciprocity norm, which is a social standard that says if someone helps out another person, that individual is expected to return the favor. Okay, so for example, if you help someone move, you probably expect in the future to return the favor, and you want them to help you move in the future. Next up, we have group polarization, which says it is after discussing a topic, the group members' beliefs become more extreme than prior to the discussion. Okay, so an example of this might be a political party meeting. Members of that political party, they go into the meeting with already held beliefs, and then their views get more extreme after discussing those beliefs. Another example of group polarization might be like an extremist group meeting, such as the one that existed in Germany back in the 1930s. I don't want to say their name due to YouTube standards, but if they go into a meeting and they discuss their topics, and as they discuss those topics, their viewpoints get more extreme, that's group polarization. Now, group polarization doesn't necessarily need to be like a bad thing. Group polarization is great for self-help groups. Like Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay, these individuals, they go in with these preconceived notions, these already, I shouldn't say preconceived, these already held beliefs, and as they discuss them, their beliefs become more extreme, and that's great for like self-help groups. Okay, now please note, this term is not saying that a person is introduced to a brand new topic, and then after being introduced to a brand new topic, they begin to accept these new ideas. It's not saying that. The term is saying that a person already holds onto some set of beliefs, and as a result of discussing those beliefs, their beliefs become more extreme. At number 95 and number 94, we have confirmation bias and belief perseverance. As it says here, confirmation bias is the tendency for a person to look for information that supports their beliefs while ignoring or dismissing evidence that does not support their position. So, for example, let's say there's an election coming up, and in this election, you like a candidate, and so what you're going to do is you're going to start to look for information that supports your political candidate looking good. Okay, you're going to only look at information or data that says, hey, your political candidate's awesome. While at the same time, you're going to ignore other information that makes them look bad. That's confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias is a little different than belief perseverance. Belief perseverance is the tendency for individuals to hold on to a belief even after being presented with information that discredits that belief. So a great example of this is flat earthers. There's a lot of data and a lot of evidence out there that discredits and disproves flat earthers, yet they go on holding onto their beliefs. In fact, there are some like YouTube clips and social media clips out there where flat earthers will do an experiment to try to prove that the earth is flat. They do the experiment and the experiment goes wrong, thus supporting that the earth is actually round, yet they still hold on to their beliefs. And it's kind of funny to see how sad they get when their, experiment goes haywire and they're disproven. So what's the difference? What's the difference between these two terms? They're very similar. Well, with confirmation bias, one is actively seeking out evidence. They're going out and seeking out evidence to support their position. And with belief perseverance, this person isn't necessarily actively seeking out evidence to support their position. They're just ignoring any information that goes against their beliefs. Now, what I want you to do is take a look at this cartoon and tell me, is this an example of belief perseverance, or is this an example of confirmation bias? Yes, it is definitely confirmation bias. Why? Because the person is actively going out and seeking information that supports their position. Great job. Next up, we have another social psych term, the self-serving bias, which is the tendency to overstate one's role when there's a positive outcome and understate it when there's a negative outcome. So for example, let's say that a student gets a good grade on a test and they attribute that good grade to them being smart. Hey, I'm smart, I studied hard, that's why I got the good grade. Okay, when there's a positive outcome, they're overstating their role. Then that same student goes to another class and they fail a test that day. And they go, oh, the reason I failed the test was because the teacher's horrible. The test was too hard. I didn't have time to study. Okay. Now they're understating their role because it's a negative outcome. That's an example of the self-serving bias. People who tend to do this a lot are politicians. Whenever something goes right, politicians are always like, hey, look at this bill that I put out, or look at this idea that, I put out that helped people. I did a great job. And then when something goes wrong, politicians quickly dodge questions and then place the blame on everybody else, even when it may actually be their fault. At number 92, we have the stereotype threat, which is the anxiety that members of a group feel if they believe their performance will conform to a negative stereotype. So one of the classic experiments that dealt with the stereotype threat dealt with a researcher who went out and did some studies with the STEM field. So historically speaking, STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and math, have been dominated by men. And as a result, there have been a lot of stereotypes that men do better than women in these fields. So one researcher went out and investigated this, and he went to a professor and said, hey, look, here's a test. When you give this test, before the test, this is what I want you to say. Before the test, I want you to say that men usually score better than women on this test. Well, what do you think happened? Yes, that's right. Women perform worse. The men scored better. That's correct. So later on, the researcher gave the test to a similar group of students, but this time around, the professor did not make any statement or announcement prior to the test. Well, this time around, when no statement was made, what were the results? Well, when nothing was said, women actually did slightly better on average than the men because the stereotype threat was not present. Moving on to another social psych set of terms, and the first term on here is the foot in the door phenomenon, and this is a type of persuasion. So what happens with a foot in the door phenomenon is a person makes an initial request to another individual, and then after that individual agrees to the initial request, a larger request is then made to that individual. And then because the individual initially agreed to the first request, they are, as it says here at number 4, they are more likely to accept the larger request after accepting the smaller one. That is the foot in the door phenomenon. So, for example, let's say that someone comes up to you and says, hey, can I talk to you for a minute about X cause? And then you agree, you say, hey, sure. And then after they talk to you for a few minutes, they may go, hey, will you be willing to donate $25 to this cause? You or the person they're asking would be more likely to say yes after agreeing to the initial smaller request. And that's just part of, human nature. And it explains what the foot in the door phenomenon actually is. And the foot in the door phenomenon is kind of the opposite of what is known as the door in the face type of persuasion. And this is where initially a large request is made. And as it says here, the individual denies that large request. And then after the individual denies that request, a smaller request is made. And because the individual initially denied the larger request, they are more likely to accept the smaller request. So for example, you say, hey, mom, can I have $50 to go hang out with my friends? Your mom says, no, she denies your request. And then you say, hey, mom, what about 20? She's going to be more likely to say, yes, that is the door in the face effect. Now, something that I need to point out, it's very, very important for both of these terms to mention point 2. All right, so with the foot in the door phenomenon, that the individual agrees to the initial request, and because they agree, they're more likely to accept the larger request. And then for number 2, with the door in the face, they have to deny it, and then a smaller request is made. And because they deny the initial request, then they are more likely to accept the smaller one. So make sure you have all of these parts. This is pretty much a summary, word for word, from a College Board FRQ scoring guideline. At number 89, we have the types of aggression. The first type of aggression is hostile aggression, where the end goal is physical harm. An example of hostile aggression would typically be a bar fight where one guy just wants to beat the snot out of another guy. That's hostile aggression. Another example of hostile aggression would be like if a guy got cheated on, so he goes and beats up the person who cheated with his wife. Okay, the end goal is harm. And that's a little different than instrumental aggression, which is where aggression is used to achieve some other means. So, for example, beating up or robbing someone to steal their wallet. The purpose is not to, the initial purpose is not just to beat them up, but the end goal is to steal the wallet. Or the classic example is like the hired assassin. Okay, their end goal is payment. Okay, so instrumental aggression is used to achieve some other means. At number 88, we have afferent and efferent sensory and motor neurons. Now, the first thing you need to know, and you probably know this because your teachers are all stars, the first thing you need to know about this term is that neurons are messengers that send signals throughout the body. So with sensory neurons, sensory neurons are going to send signals from your senses, touch, taste, smell, etc., from your senses to your spinal cord and brain. Okay, sensory neurons, and as you can see here, sensory neurons send information at the brain. So think sensory at afferent. Afferent at the brain. That's a little mnemonic device versus motor neurons, which send information from the brain to the rest of the body. So the most simplified way to think of what motor neurons do is motor neurons control movement. So when I'm moving my hands, that's the result of motor neurons being sent signals from the brain to my hands, or if I'm running, motor neurons. So motor neurons, movement. Motor neurons also control your heart, digestion, breathing, etc. So motor neurons control movement, and they're also known as efferent or exiting neurons because they exit the brain. Next up, number 87, we have long-term potentiation, which is a process by which synaptic connections between neurons become stronger with frequent activation. So the thing that you need to understand about this term is that when we form a new memory or learn a new skill, neurons are making new connections or forming new pathways in the brain. So when we go to recall that memory or perform that task or skill in the future, what's happening is that we are activating or firing that same exact pathway that did not exist prior to learning that new skill, task, or memory. So when we learn something new for the first time, those new connections between neurons along the pathway are going to be super, super weak. And if you don't practice that information, those connections will physically break apart. And biologically speaking, that is what forgetting is, the breaking apart of neural pathways. So to keep those neural connections from breaking apart, you need to rehearse or practice the information over and over and over again to make sure those connections are stronger and stronger and stronger. And as a result, you'll be less likely to forget that information. So let's say, for example, you learn a new term in science class. When you start out learning a new term, those connections are going to be very weak. But you go home and you practice your flashcards and practice and rehearse that term over and over and over, those synaptic connections will become stronger and stronger and stronger the more that they fire together. And that's exactly what long-term potentiation is. Now, real quick, you probably know this already. Please note, neurons don't technically touch each other, even though we say that they're connected. However, there is a glue that makes the bonds between neurons stronger the more often that they fire together. Now we have a bonus term, and that is arousal. And the reason we're going over this is because we're going to be talking about arousal and applying to a bunch of other terms tonight. So arousal is a state of alertness and or being awake. And so let's say that you hear a loud bang or you hear a twig snap in the woods behind you in the dark and you're alone. Okay, you're going to feel aroused or alert. And your body's going to go, hey, is this a threat? Do I need to run? Do I need to fight? In other words, being aroused or alert prepares you to react to stimulus or stimuli in the environment. And some physiological indicators of arousal kick in when you're nervous, when your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. So for example, when one is aroused, they're going to have an increased heart rate. They're going to have higher blood pressure, increased perspiration, rapid breathing, pupil dilation, and more. And another part of the body within the brain that controls arousal is the reticular formation. And as you can see here, the reticular formation is a network of nerves that runs up and down the brainstem, and it controls arousal and focus. So, for example, if this was severed, if somehow a doctor was able to go in and just sever the reticular formation, you would fall into a coma that you would never be able to wake up from. At the same time, if you were in a deep sleep and a doctor was able to probe it and stimulate your reticular formation, you would jump wide awake. So that is arousal and some other kind of bonus terms to go along with that.
Today, we're going to go over the different parts of the nervous system. The first thing we're going to look at is the difference between the central and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord, the brain being the control center of the body, and the spinal cord being the information highway that sends messages to and from the brain and to and from the rest of the body. Next up, we have the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of nerves that branch off of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is divided into two parts called the somatic and autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system controls voluntary movement via the use of our skeletal muscles. In addition to motor nerves, it contains sensory nerves as well. For example, if you hit your finger with a hammer, that's going to be detected by the somatic nervous system and sent to your brain for processing. Next up, we have the autonomic nervous system, which controls our digestive, respiratory, circulatory, and reproductive functions. The autonomic nervous system is split into two parts, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is our body's alert system that responds to stressors, which includes anything from running away from a guy with a chainsaw to the physiological arousal that takes place while you're playing a sport or taking a test. When the sympathetic nervous system is active, our heart rate accelerates, noradrenaline is released for the fight or flight response, digestion slows down to conserve energy, our pupils dilate, and more. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. It calms the body down after a stressful situation. For example, the heart rate slows down, digestion picks back up, the pupils constrict, and more. So the question remains, when this guy yeeted his golf club into the stratosphere, did the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system kick in the second the club left his hands?
That brings us to number 86, the arousal theory of motivation. And this says that people are motivated to engage in a given behavior to raise or lower their arousal. For example, if someone wants to raise their arousal level, what's something that they could do? Roller coaster, go for a run. Yeah. Exercise. Good. Okay. And then maybe something that could lower their arousal level would be like relaxation techniques or just sitting on the couch and watching TV. Okay. Now, when you see the arousal theory of motivation, it could also relate to the Yerkes-Dodson law, which is actually our number 27 overall term. Basically, real quickly, the Yerkes-Dodson law says that people perform their best at a moderate level of arousal. Now, there's way more to that, but arousal theory could also be referring to Yerkes-Dodson. So just a heads up. At number 85, we have the different theories of emotion. These come up all the time. You have to know them. There's a lot of them. So let's go through this real quick. The first theory is the common sense theory, which says there's a stimulus. And the stimulus we're just going to use for this example over and over is a twig snapping in the woods. You're walking alone at night. Okay. And that's the stimulus. So according to the common sense theory, after the stimulus, the emotion kicks in. You start to feel afraid. And because you feel afraid, that leads to the arousal kicking in. That leads to your heart racing, your pupils dilating, sweaty palms, your breathing going faster. Okay. Emotion leads to the arousal. That is the common sense theory. Then you have the James Lange theory, which switches the arousal and the emotion. So you have the stimulus, you have the twigs snapping in the woods, then your heart beats faster, your palms get sweaty, your pupils dilate. And then as a result of the arousal, the James Lange theory says this leads to the emotion of fear. And by the way, this is the same James as in William James you learned in probably the first or second unit of your AP psychology course. And then next up, we have the Cannon-Bard theory, which says when the stimulus goes off, again, the twig snapping, it will lead to simultaneously the emotion and the arousal kick in at the same exact time. That's the Cannon-Bard theory. And then Next up, a very interesting theory is the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, which says, hey, you have a stimulus, again, the twig snapping. The stimulus causes your heart to beat fast, your palms to sweat, your pupils to dilate. And then you have something down here called cognitive appraisal. And cognitive appraisal says, hey, look, I noticed that my heart's beating faster and my breathing's picked up, but why? Why? Well, I need to appraise or evaluate the stimulus. Oh, there was that twig snapping behind me in the woods in the dark. And because I'm evaluating the stimulus, this will lead to the emotion. And in this case, it's fear. Now, let's change up the stimulus real quick instead of having a twig snap. Okay, let's say the stimulus is a roller coaster. The roller coaster is going to make your heart beat faster. It's going to make your pupils dilate and do all those things related to arousal. It's going to do all the same exact physiological things as the last slide. But because of the cognitive appraisal, you have to go, okay, why are all of these systems kicking in? Oh, it's because I'm on a roller coaster. And assuming you love roller coasters like I do, that's going to lead to a different emotion. And in this case, it's going to lead to joy. So that is the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion. And then you have other guys named Zients and Ladeau, and they argue that cognition does not always precede an emotional response. Cognition does not always precede an emotional response. So let's say that you're looking at something in the environment, but let's say you're looking at something scary like a spider or a snake or anything that's scary. That information is going to be sent to the thalamus. And remember, the thalamus is the air traffic control center of the brain, and it's going to reroute it directly to the amygdala. And the amygdala is the part of the brain that is the first responder to stress. And it also deals with like extreme emotions like anger, fear, rage, stuff like that. Again, Zients and Ladeau argue that cognition does not always precede an emotional response. It just happens automatically. And by the way, bonus question here, what sense does the thalamus not reroute to the correct location of the brain? Smell, yes. We talked about how Zients and Ladeau say, hey, cognition does not always precede an emotional response. Well, Schachter and Singer and Richard Lazarus would say, well, there are times that you have to think about what you're seeing in the environment. So according to Schachter and Singer, if you see a spider, a snake, whatever it may be, that information is going to be routed to the thalamus. And instead of going directly to the amygdala, it's going to go from the thalamus to the visual cortex. And it's going to work in conjunction with other parts of your brain, like the frontal lobe. And after your brain processes and goes, hey, that's a scary stimulus, it's eventually going to be sent to the amygdala. So Schachter and Singer and Richard Lazarus say, hey, nope, there isn't this like fast route. There's a more slow way of processing the information in the environment, which will eventually cause an emotional response. And lastly, for the theories of emotion, we do have Lazarus's cognitive appraisal theory. It's very similar to the Cannon-Bard theory. It says, hey, you got a stimulus up front, and what your brain's going to do is it's going to evaluate. It's going to appraise the stimulus. Oh, that's kind of scary. And as a result of appraising the stimulus, it's going to lead to the emotional response and the arousal happening at the same exact time. So this is like Cannon and Bard, except with the cognitive appraisal aspect right in the middle of it. At number 84, we have the cerebellum. Now, you need to know every single part of the brain, inside and out, okay? But we're going to highlight the cerebellum here. The cerebellum is attached to the brain stem, and it sits below the cerebrum with all these different lobes. Now, the main functions of the cerebellum deal with coordination, motor control, balance, and in fact, in regards to balance, it works in conjunction with the vestibular system, those semicircular canals to keep you upright and keep you, balanced. Now, one thing to note about the cerebellum is that it deals with the fine tuning of movement. In other words, if the cerebellum is damaged, you'll be able to move your hands and feet around, but you wouldn't be able to have the coordination to like play the guitar or type on the keyboard because the fine tuning of movement has been destroyed to like whatever damaged the cerebellum. If the cerebellum was damaged, you also wouldn't be able to like dance because you couldn't maintain your balance. Something else that's important to note about the cerebellum is that slurred speech and stumbling happen here when alcohol affects this region of the brain. So I'll say that again, slurred speech and stumbling happen here if someone's, drinking too much, that's affecting the cerebellum. And the last very important thing that you need to know about the cerebellum is that it plays a role in muscle memory or procedural memory. Procedural memory is a type of implicit memory that does not require conscious recall. And what procedural or muscle memory is memories of skills that are built up through repetition over and over and over. So a classic example of procedural memory is shooting a foul shot. You take those foul shots and you shoot them over and over and over until you really don't have to think about it. It's just, muscle memory. Riding a bike is another example of a procedural memory. Okay, so these are types of procedural memories that are processed by the cerebellum. Here's the next question. Which side of the brain, according to College Board, because it's a little more complicated than this, but according to College Board and the AP Psych test that you're going to take, which side of the brain processes language? What do we got? Which side of the brain processes language? The hemisphere of the brain, according to College Board, we're oversimplifying things, that processes language is the left side of the brain. Please, please, please note that it's the left side or the left hemisphere of the brain. Now, technically speaking, it's a little more complex than that, but for College Board purposes, the left side of the brain processes language. In reality, language processing can be found in the left hemisphere for about 90% of right-handed people, okay, and 70% of left-handed people. So it's a little more complicated than that, but for College Board purposes, it's the left side. There are three major areas that you need to know in regards to the processing of language. The first area is the Broca's area, which is in the prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe. The Broca's area produces speech. I'll say that again. The Broca's area produces speech. Okay, so the way I like to remember this, and it's ridiculous, it's silly, and remember, the more wild and wacky your mnemonic device is, the more likely you are to remember the thing on the test. But the way I remember the Broca's area is how lacrosse guys go around going, bro, what's up, bro, 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 bro. Okay, they need their Broca's area to make that sound, to make the word bro. Okay, so the Broca's area produces speech. And damage to this area, whether due to like a disease, trauma, or a stroke, leads to expressive aphasia, where one is not able to speak. And expressive aphasia can be, a complete loss of speech or a partial loss of speech. It just depends. Next up, we have Wernicke's area on the temporal lobe here. Remember, the temporal lobe processes is incoming sound. And we have Wernicke's area, which interprets spoken language. Wernicke's area interprets spoken language. Okay, so you would not be able to understand what I'm saying without your Wernicke's area right now. And damage to this region would lead to receptive aphasia, which is the loss of the ability to comprehend spoken language and also written language. And then lastly, on the parietal lobe here, we have the angular gyrus, which takes visual stimuli, like the letters or words on the page or the words on the screen that you're reading right now. It takes visual stimuli and turns it into auditory information, which then Wernicke's area uses to understand what is written. Okay, so it looks at the images and it sends it over to Wernicke's area, and Wernicke's area is able to understand what is written. So what this means is this: damage to the angular gyrus leaves a person able to speak and understand what spoken language, but unable to read and write. So that is the angular gyrus. At number 82, we have inattentional blindness, and this goes hand in hand with selective attention. Well, selective attention is focusing on one thing while ignoring everything else, and we can define inattentional blindness as failing to notice a recognizable stimulus because one's attention is focused elsewhere. Now, there are a couple examples out there of a classic experiment where the video starts off with, count the number of passes the team in white makes. The team in white and the team in black both have a basketball. And so you're supposed to count how many passes the team in white makes. But you're busy focusing on how many passes they make. And let's say they make like 13 passes. And you're like, oh yeah, they made 13 passes. Well, this is going on at full speed. And the video is like, hey, congratulations if you got 13 passes. And then it said, Yeah, they got 13 passes, but did you see the moonwalking bear come through the screen in the middle? And the majority of people who watch this do not see the moonwalking bear due to inattentional blindness. Okay, they're selectively attending to the passes being made, and this bear comes through, does a little dance, and you miss it. At number 81, we have the cocktail party effect. And this says it's a person's ability to focus on one stimulus while ignoring all others. And it's a type of selective attention. So, for example, let's say you're at a school dance and there's a lot of noise and a lot of stuff going on around you. Even though there's all this noise and stuff going on around you, you're still able to focus on and hear and understand the person right next to you due to your selective attention and the cocktail party effect. Another example of this would be like if you're in a loud setting, like a sports game, or you're at a restaurant or wherever, and you hear your name, someone say your name from across the room. You're able to selectively attend to that person saying your name, even though there is so much other stimuli going on in the environment, the cocktail party effect. At number 80, we have cognitive maps. This is Tolman's cognitive maps. Remember, Tolman did the whole rats thing. So cognitive maps are a mental representation of the layout of one's environment. So go ahead and close your eyes for a second. Can you picture how to get to your friend's house step by step without using a GPS or map? If you can do so, that's an example of a cognitive map. Or can you picture how to navigate around your school going from first period to your last period of the day? If you can picture how to navigate the building, then that's an example of a cognitive map. At number 79, we have Kurt Lewin's types of conflict. The first type of conflict is the approach conflict, where one has a choice between two desirable outcomes. So an example of this might be choosing between two good colleges. Another example of this might be, hey, you get to choose between going to a movie with your friends and you really want to see this movie, or going on a date with that person from your psych class. Okay, you got two good options there, and then you have to make a choice between those two good options. And then you also have the avoidance conflict, which is a choice between two options that have unattractive outcomes. So maybe your parents say, hey, you can either clean the bathroom or mow the lawn. You have two unattractive outcomes. You also have the approach avoidance, which is when one event or goal has attractive and unattractive features. So let's say someone wants ice cream, but at the same time, they are also lactose intolerant. That's an example of the approach avoidance conflict. And then lastly, we have the multiple approach avoidance conflict, where you have to choose between two or more options, and each option has both desirable and undesirable features. So for example, option one, you're going to go on vacation and there's an amazing location. It's beautiful. However, it's super, super, super expensive. Versus option two is a solid location. It's not as good as option one, but it's a lot cheaper. So again, the multiple approach avoidance conflict is the choice between two or more options that both have desirable and undesirable features. Next up, we have habituation, which is the diminished effectiveness of a stimulus in eliciting a response or bringing about a response following repeated exposure to the stimulus. A good example of this would be, like, let's say your parents buy a house near an airport, and at first, all you can pay attention to is the loud and noisy planes going by. But over time, even though those planes are still loud and noisy, you get used to them and you ignore them due to the habituation process. Another example of habituation would be like, hey, you're playing peekaboo with a little kid. You're playing peekaboo, and at first they love it, but over time they're just like, okay, I've seen it all. I'm done with peekaboo. Let me pay attention or focus on something else. Again, the diminished effectiveness of a stimulus in bringing about a response follow repeated exposure to that stimulus. Here's my next question. If someone gave you this briefcase and said, there's $1 million inside if you can get the right combination, how could you be sure to guarantee yourself that you would get the right combination? Yes, you could try every combination starting at 000, then go to 001, 002, 003. And this is an example of an algorithm, which is a step-by-step procedure that guarantees solving a problem. However, the downside to an algorithm is that it is slow. It can take a very long time to potentially get that right answer. Now, it could be quick, but typically it's slow. So know that term. That showed up a lot in recent years. At number 76, we have framing, which is presenting a problem, question, or situation in a way that impacts how the issue is perceived. So let me give you two scenarios. A doctor comes up to me and says, hey, there's a 10% chance you will die during the surgery, versus, hey, Mr. Ireland, there's a 90% chance you will survive this surgery. That's an example of framing, right? They both mean the same thing, but the way it's worded or framed is totally different. Source amnesia or source misattribution is incorrectly identifying where a memory came from. So, as I was saying, there's an election coming up. You tell your friend about something that a candidate allegedly said or did, and they go, hey, where'd you hear that? And you go, oh, I don't know, maybe YouTube or a news article or something. That's source amnesia. Or maybe you go up to a friend and say, hey, did you hear about that really epic thing that happened the other day? And they say, yeah, I heard about it because I'm the one who told you that last week. That's source misattribution. I want you to look at these letters, memorize as many of these letters as possible. I have a second row here. Go ahead and take a couple seconds to memorize row 2, which contain actually the same exact letters. Can you guys recall the letters from the second row? I would hope so. So again, row 1 and row 2 contain the same exact letters, but why was row 2 easier to memorize? And that's because the letters were organized or chunked into more meaningful units. So that's what term 74 is. The term is chunking, organizing information into meaningful units to be stored in memory. And when you chunk information, it helps you memorize things way, way more efficiently. So here's another example of chunking. Okay, here's a grocery list. Your parents say memorize it, and for whatever reason, you can't put it in your phone and you can't write it down. Okay, so this is an unchunked list. You're more likely to memorize and recall it later if you chunk this list by the type of meal you're trying to make. Another example of chunking would be an acronym, which is a word that's created by combining typically the first letters of a phrase together. These are examples of chunking. What does Roy G. Biv and what does PEMDAS stand for? It's the colors of the rainbow. And then PEMDAS is your order of operations for math. You got your parentheses, your exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. And those are examples of chunking. At number 73, we have functional fixedness, which is a cognitive bias that limits a person's ability to use an object in a way other than its intended purpose. So as a result, a person can become stuck or fixated with their inability to think of an alternate use for that object. So, for example, can anybody think of an alternate use for a quarter? Its primary use is to pay for things. That's its intended function. Okay, but can anybody think of another use for a quarter? Scratch card, coin flip, unlocking doors. So you have overcome functional fixedness. If you thought that the only use for a quarter was using it to pay for something, you would be stuck or fixated. By thinking of alternative uses for a quarter, you have overcome functional fixedness. So great job there. All right, here's an example of someone else overcoming functional fixedness. They're using their coffee pot for something other than its primary intended purpose. And in this case, it's to cook a hot dog. That is overcoming functional fixedness. At number 72, we have a mental set is when an individual uses a solution that worked in the past on a current problem, which may or may not help solve the current problem. So for example, the last time your computer froze, you restarted it and it worked. So this time your computer freezes, you're going to restart it hoping that it will work again. Or the classic I like to point to is like a little kid trying to pull one of these doors. Okay, you don't know really which way this door is going to open because they have the handlebars on both sides. Okay, so last time they tried the door, they pulled and it opened, so that when they go up to the door this time, they're going to try pulling and they're not going to be able to open it from the opposite side. That would be an example of a mental set. At number 71, we have reciprocal determinism. This is Bandura's reciprocal determinism. I would say Bandura is probably one of, if not the most popular psychologist researcher to show up on the AP Psych test. So know everything about Bandura. And reciprocal determinism is the belief that one's thoughts, behavior, and environment all influence one another. So let's say there's an individual, we'll call them Sally. Okay, Sally has some personal factors. Her belief, her cognition, her thought about herself is that she is a good student. And because she thinks she's a good student, she studies hard. That's her behavior, studying hard. And because she studies hard, it leads her to get good grades. And when she gets good grades, she gets praise from her teachers and family. And because she gets praise from her teachers and family, she believes herself to be a good student. And at the same time, that reinforces her notion that she should continue to study harder. So again, reciprocal determinism is the belief that one's thoughts, behavior, and the environment all influence one another. Now, on the AP Psych test, make sure you identify all three parts or all three aspects of reciprocal determinism. Up next, at number 70, we have Julian Rotter's personal control. And the first thing we're going to talk about is an external locus of control, which is one's perception that chance or outside forces control their fate, versus an internal locus of control, or the perception that an individual can control their own fate. Okay, so if someone were to say, no matter what I do, no matter how hard I study, no matter what I do, I cannot impact my AP Psych test score, that would be an external locus of control. That person would believe that there's nothing they could do to have a positive impact on that situation. Okay, versus someone who says, if I study hard, I can do well on the AP Psych test, even though it may be difficult. That's an internal locus of control. And who achieves more in general? The person who has an internal locus of control achieves more than the person with an external locus of control who believes that outside forces control fate and everything about their life. That brings us to the learned helplessness experiment. And this was a very interesting experiment by Martin Seligman. So this is a two-part experiment where you have in part one, 3 groups of dogs who were all harnessed up. Group 1 was harnessed up, but they were not shocked. That was the control group. Group 2 was harnessed up. They were shocked. However, there was a lever that the dogs could hit to stop the shock. And then lastly, there was group 3 who was shocked, and the lever was present, but when they hit the lever, nothing happened. And so they continued to be shocked. And then these dogs from each of these groups were taken and put into part 2 of the experiment. They were put into this little contraption right here. Now, group 1, they were put in this contraption, and as you can see on this side of the floor, the dogs were shocked. However, they could escape to the other side of the floor where they would not be shocked. Well, group 1, the control group, once they were shocked, they jumped to the other side to safety. Group 2, who was shocked, but when they hit the lever, the shock stopped, they also jumped to the other side to safety. However, group 3, who had learned previously that, hey, no matter what I do, I cannot stop the shock, instead of jumping to the other side to safety, group 3 just stood there and accepted the shock. Okay, even though there was a way out. There was a way out, but they accepted the shock. And this is very similar to an external locus of control, the belief that no matter what I do, I cannot control the outcome of my situation. And the way we define learned helplessness is as follows. When one feels as if they are unable to change the outcome of their situation after repeated aversive events. and this leads to a pessimistic outlook. And a pessimistic person, or someone who maintains a pessimistic explanatory style, expects bad things to happen. They believe that things are beyond their control, versus someone with an optimistic explanatory style. An optimist believes or tends to see the good in things, even in bad situations. And optimists also tend to believe that problems are temporary and not their own fault. So, examples of learned helplessness, you have the dog experiment, or you could just think of a student who is struggling in school. If a student fails a couple of tests, they may give up. They may go, why try? There's nothing I can do to impact the outcome of this situation. And related to this is positive psychology. So this is Martin Seligman. He was the creator of positive psychology. And positive psychology, as it says here, focuses on the study of optimal human functioning and the factors that allow individuals to thrive. Kind of ironic when you're shocking dogs there. Well, why is this important? Well, positive psychologists, kind of similar to cognitive psychologists, like to challenge individuals' beliefs. So, for example, if a person experienced learned helplessness, or if they have a pessimistic outlook because they failed a test, instead of getting that person to go, hey, I'm stupid, a positive psychologist would encourage an individual to argue with themselves or challenge their own beliefs by saying things like, I could have studied better and will do so next time. I should have asked the teacher for help and will do so next time. That's what positive psychology is all about. Humanistic psychology, and we have to talk a little bit about humanistic psychology and give some background to talk about the next couple of terms. Humanistic psychology is all about self-improvement and helping people become the best person they can be. The founder of humanistic psychology was Carl Rogers, and another big guy by the name of Abraham Maslow, which brings us to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the basic premise behind Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that we all kind of start at the bottom level here, where our physiological needs are. And once most of the needs are met in one level, then we can hopefully move on up to the next level, with the ultimate goal of being self-actualized or reaching self-actualization. Okay, so first off, psychological needs need to be met. So people need air, obviously. Without it, you know where that goes. They need food and water. So once most of the needs are met here, then they can worry more about their safety needs. They can worry more about, job security, employment, personal security, having property. Okay, shelter and property, maybe not always the same. Someone who is homeless might have shelter, but not have like a house or an apartment to live in. Once safety needs are met, people are going to worry about building relationships and then esteem needs. Okay, and again, the ultimate goal is self-actualization. And the way College Board defines self-actualization is fulfilling one's highest potential, being fully accepting of oneself, or becoming one's ideal self. So make sure you get that definition down. That's important because self-actualization comes up a lot. Now, there's a lot of criticisms of Maslow's hierarchy in that self-actualization is actually hard to define. Okay, you obviously have a definition here, but how do you measure or test self-actualization? And the other thing is self-actualization could look different from person to person. It could look different from me to you. It could look different. Okay, so that is a criticism of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And then also under the humanistic psychology umbrella, you have what is called the self concept that Maslow and Rogers talked about. So the self concept asks the question, how do you see yourself? Do you see yourself in a positive or negative light? So this person on the left has a lot more positive thoughts about themselves compared to the person on the right. So the person on the left has a positive self concept, and the person on the right has a negative self concept. And in dealing with this concept of self-concept, Rogers talks about the difference between what is known as the ideal self, who we want to be, and the real self, who we actually are. So this person ideally wants to be an honest person. They want to be a hard worker, but in reality, they cheat on a test. They don't study. And as a result, this leads to incongruence, and an incongruence can lead to stress and anxiety. So the question becomes, how do we get rid of the incongruence so that we can have congruence? And when we have congruence, Rogers says we become fully functioning people, which was just kind of his word for self-actualization. So to get rid of this incongruence, Rogers said individuals needed to be treated with what is known as an unconditional positive regard, which is just where a person like a teacher, a therapist, or parent is fully accepting towards another individual, even if the bad behavior is not accepted. So, for example, a humanistic therapist or a humanistic psychologist would show acceptance and compassion towards an alcoholic, but they would not accept their behavior. And for a parent, they can show their kid an unconditional positive regard by showing them that their behavior is what's bad and not the child themselves. So, for example, let's say a parent has a kid, the kid takes a marker or pen and starts drawing all over the walls. And as a result, the parent comes up and says, "Hey, you're a bad boy." Well, that's not showing an unconditional positive regard. At this point, the kid may think, well, I like drawing on the wall. I must be bad. Or coloring on the wall is bad, and I'm bad if I like it. So now I don't like coloring as a result. So what the parent should say instead, according to Rogers, is that, hey, look, I love you, but I don't like it when you draw on the wall. And by doing this, the parent is affirming the kid, but not the behavior. And by doing so, the parent is showing an unconditional positive regard, which is not going to cause incongruence for the child. So if we zoom in here, this person now has congruence because they've been treated with an unconditional positive regard, where the ideal self and the real self line up more than before. Okay, now we have congruence, which leads to a higher mental well-being and a higher self-esteem. Please note that there's probably always going to be some type of incongruence, but the more congruence, the better. So higher congruence leads to higher self-esteem, and self-esteem can be defined as feelings of self-worth. So someone with a high self-esteem may say, hey, what I do matters. I'm a good student. I look great in what I wear. I'm fun to be with. Okay, those are traits of someone with a high self-esteem. And someone with a low self-esteem may say the opposite. So people with a high self-esteem tend to be happier. They tend to be healthier. They're better able to cope with stress in general. Now, one thing that I want you to note is this. Don't confuse the term self-esteem with the term self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the number 23 FRQ term overall, and self-efficacy can be defined as one's confidence in their own ability to complete a task. So, for example, if your coach looks at you and says, hey, I want you to take the last shot with the game on the line, your confidence in your ability to hit that shot would be your self-efficacy. Okay, if you think you're going to hit that shot, you're going to have a high self-efficacy versus if you think you're going to miss the shot. Same thing with your AP Psych test. If you think you're going to get an A on the AP Psych test, you're going to have a high or a 5, I should say. You're going to have a high self-efficacy. Now, as it says here, too much self-esteem can lead to narcissism, which is an inflated view of oneself that leads to attention-seeking and exploitative behavior. So just be aware of that and know this term, because narcissism could show up. Something that I want to run through real quickly, because I think this is going to be a review for most of you, is the measures of central tendency, which include the mean, median, and mode, and also the range. So as you probably know, the mean is the average in a data set, the median is the middle number, and the mode's the most common number. So on the AP Psych test, whenever you get a data set, the first thing you want to do is unscramble the data so that the numbers are in ascending order. They're increasing. And we're going to use this data set for the next couple of examples. So when calculating the mean, what you need to do is you need to add up the sum of the numbers and divide it by the total number of values in the data set. So we're going to add up 1 plus 1 plus 3 plus 4 plus 6. And there are how many numbers in this data set? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So adding up the numbers, dividing it by the total number in the data set, and we can simplify it to 15 divided by 5, and therefore the mean or the average is 3. And on the test, don't just write the number 3. You're going to want to write out, hey, the mean is 3 in relation to whatever they're asking you to do on the FRQ. The median is the middle number. Okay, so you find the middle number of the data set. In this case, it's real easy. It's 3. If you have a data set with an even amount of numbers in it, then you take the two middle numbers and average them together. Lastly is the mode. The mode is the most common number or the most frequently occurring number. And in this case, it's obvious 1 occurs the most frequently. And then the range, which is the largest number minus the smallest number. So it's going to be 6 minus 1, and the range is 5. Boom. That brings us to number 63, standard deviation, which tells us how close the values in a data set are to the mean. So, for example, right here we have two bell curves, two normal distributions or normal curves. And the red curve has a small deviation. In other words, the data are more squished up against the mean, while the blue curve has a large deviation. The data is way more spread out. But the way the College Board wants you to say this is that the scores in the blue data set are more varied. Don't say squished or spread out, say varied. The scores in the blue data set are more varied than the scores in the red data set. So that is standard deviation. And if you get a question on the test that says something like, which of the following options has the greatest standard deviation? You could calculate it, but it would take you forever. Or you can use a shortcut, and that shortcut or trick is to look at the range. So if you look at the range for all of these options, option A, 24 minus 10, it's going to be 14. The range for B is 25. The range for C is 3. Okay. And then it asks which of the following options has the greatest standard deviation. In this case, since it's greatest, it's going to be the one with the largest range, and therefore B is the correct answer. So option B is going to look more like this blue curve here than the red curve. Another real quick example comes from the 2021 AP Psych FRQ Set 2. And it says, explain what the different standard deviations indicate about the data for the two groups. So group A has a standard deviation of 4, and group B has a standard deviation of 6. Well, you can't just say, hey, group B standard deviation is larger. What you need to say is the following. The data in group B is more varied than the data in group A. That's what College Board wants you to say. And it looks like this. Group A has the smaller deviation. Group B has the larger deviation. And once again, the data in group B is more varied than the data in group A. At number 62, we have the circadian rhythm, which are biological cycles that occur about every 24 hours. And these biological cycles deal with how awake or tired we are, or maybe we're completely asleep, and also body temperature. So, for example, when we wake up in the morning, our body temperature starts to rise a little bit. And when we go to sleep, our body temperature decreases. That brings us to number 61, REM sleep. Now, we don't have time to go into all the stages of sleep. We don't have time to go into all the little details about sleep disorders and all that stuff. We're going to focus mainly on REM sleep. And as it says here, REM sleep stands for rapid eye movement sleep. So what happens during REM sleep is your eyes are closed, and behind your closed eyelid, your eyeballs are moving around rapidly as such. That is REM sleep. Now, that's not what you need to say on your AP Psych test. I just wanted to describe that to you. REM sleep is where most dreams occur. Most dreams occur during REM sleep. That's really important. And one of the theories behind what the purpose of REM sleep is that our brains process and consolidate our experiences and memories from that day. That's one of the theories behind REM sleep. Another thing to know about REM sleep is that it is considered paradoxical sleep. In other words, your arm and leg muscles are very relaxed, and therefore, during REM sleep, your arm and leg muscles, you can't move them. But at the same time, your brain is very active and is producing the same type of brain waves as if you were wide awake. So during REM sleep, your brain produces beta waves, and while you're wide awake, your brain also produces beta waves. So it's exactly the same. So this is considered paradoxical sleep. You can't move, but your brain is super, super, super active. Another thing that you need to know is that when you miss a lot of sleep, you enter REM rebound. And REM rebound is what happens if you miss a lot of sleep. You will tend to spend more time in the REM cycle than you normally would. And so that's it for REM, but don't forget about the other stuff that you need to know in regards to sleep and dreams. Real quickly, let's talk about some correlation stuff. Okay, correlational studies show relationships. So right here we have a positive correlation, a negative correlation, and no correlation. And you should know, and this is the number 16 term overall, that correlation does not imply causation. If you see correlation on your AP Psych test, this should be the first thing you write down. So here's an example. As ice cream sales increase and then decrease, so do violent crimes. Do ice cream sales cause the violent crimes? No. And this is why correlation does not imply causation. This has more to do with weather than anything else. And you should also note that only experiments can prove cause and effect. That's really important. So if you see something about an experiment, you should write only experiments can prove cause and effect. And if you see something about correlations on the FRQ, write correlation does not imply causation. Which brings us to number 60, the correlation coefficient, or R values. The correlation coefficient shows us a number, and usually with AP Psych, this will be a given number that shows us a strength of relationship between two things, like we looked at back on those graphs. So a R value or correlation coefficient of 0 shows no correlation. A R value that is positive between 0 and positive 1 shows you a positive increasing correlation. And then an R value between 0 and negative 1 shows you a negative correlation. And what you need to know is that the further from 0, the stronger the relationship. So for example, here's one R value, R equals negative 0.86. Here's another R value, R equals positive 0.5. Okay, the further from 0, the stronger the relationship. So the R value of negative 0.86 has a stronger relationship than the R value of 0.5. Here's a quick practice problem for you. Which of the following has the strongest relationship? And this is a little bit of a trick question. The correct answer is B. B, R equals 0.9. And the reason it's B is because the R value has to fall between negative 1 and positive 1. Okay, some people were saying E, R equals negative 1.2, but that can't be correct because that is beyond the limit. Okay, that is beyond negative 0.1. So the correct answer is B, 0.9. Okay, it's got to be within the limits. That was a little bit of a trick question, so watch out for that. At number 59, we have parenting styles. Let's go through these real quick. A parent who is very supportive but also imposes strong discipline is considered an authoritative parent. This type of parent often praises their child as much as they punish them. They often explain the purpose of the punishment. These children tend to be more independent than not. Okay. Now, here's a great example of correlation is not causation. Okay. Just because someone doesn't have an authoritative parent doesn't mean they're doomed to, a terrible life or anything like that. Next up, we have authoritarian. And the way I like to remember authoritarian is authoritarian, I think authoritarian totalitarian. Okay, totalitarian dictators are super strict. Okay, now I'm not comparing authoritarian parents to totalitarian dictators who are awful and evil, but think of the strictness and think of how totalitarian and authoritarian end in the same ending of the word. So authoritarian parents have strong discipline. They will often not tell the kid why they punish them. They will say to the kid, oh, you're being punished because I said so. They're very strict. They often don't give the kid a lot of autonomy. The parent often makes decisions for the kid. And as a result, authoritarian children tend to be more susceptible to peer pressure. And then you have very supportive parents with weak discipline. This is the permissive parent. This type of parent makes few demands of the child. They often give in to what the child wants to do and may try to be best friends with the child. And then lastly, we have neglectful, which is pretty self-explanatory. Little support and weak discipline. At number 58, we have Freud's defense mechanisms, and these are used to relieve anxiety. We don't have enough time to go into all of them here, okay, but if you would like, you can take a screenshot and you got examples of each. Now, one thing I do want to note is that with repression, the idea of one blocks or banishes memories from one's mind, it used to be thought that this was very common, that a lot of people went through some sort of childhood trauma or abuse, and therefore they repress those memories. But in reality, have found in more recent years that it's actually not that common. And here is part 2 of Freud's defense mechanisms. Kohlberg's moral development. Now, we're going to go through this real quickly. So, Kohlberg has 3 levels: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional, and then a bunch of stages with each of these. So, the first stage, level 1, stage 1, is the obedience and punishment stage. The obedience and punishment stage. And here, a person makes moral decisions that are based off trying to avoid punishment and negative consequences. So maybe a parent tells a kid, hey, you can't have a cookie, don't eat a cookie right now. And a kid at this stage would think, hey, I shouldn't go get a cookie because my parents are going to put me in timeout if I take one without their permission. They're all focused on avoiding punishment. Or maybe a man shouldn't steal because he'll get in trouble. Obedience and punishment. Next up is individualism and exchange. This stage is all about what's in it for me. A person makes moral decisions based off of the question, what's in it for me? So it's also based off of the cliche, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. What's in it for me? You help me, I'll help you. So for example, let's say that Billy has a bunch of tests coming up on the same day. And Billy knows that one of his classmates, Sarah, has cheated off him before. So Billy believes it's okay to cheat off Sarah this time around as a means of returning the favor. That's what the reciprocity and exchange topic is all about. Level 2, stage 3 is the good boy, good girl stage. This is where an individual makes moral decisions that are based off of what others think. You know, what will my friends think if I do this? What will my family think if I do that? And this brings us to Kohlberg's made-up scenario called the Heinz dilemma that he would give his subjects. So in this Heinz dilemma, in this scenario, this made-up character named Heinz has a wife who was terminally sick. And as it turns out, there's a doctor who creates this miracle drug that could save Heinz's wife's life. However, Heinz can't afford the drug. It's too expensive. So then Kohlberg would ask his participants, what should Heinz do in the scenario? Should he let his wife die? Should he steal the drug or something else? And from their answers, he would categorize his participants into the stages of moral reasoning. So someone in the good boy, good girl stage might respond, Heinz should not steal because his friends and family will judge him for stealing. Or they might say, hey, it's okay for Heinz to steal because what kind of person would let his wife die? A good husband will take care of his family. Next up, we have the law and order stage, level 2, stage 4. And this is where people make moral choices based off of society as a whole, not just close friends and family. In other words, it's wrong for Heinz to steal the drug because it's against the law. And that's what people may think. And laws are needed in order to have society function properly. The level 3, stage 5 stage is the social contract, which is, if you remember from American government or American history, a social contract is where we give up some rights to the government in order to have others, like our natural rights to life, liberty, and property, protected. So for example, we give up our ability to go 100 miles an hour down the road so that our lives are protected via safer roads. So typically speaking, individuals at this stage really don't want to break the law because they believe laws are good and important. However, they also believe that laws should be changed through the democratic process, not through civil disobedience. But there are times or occasions where laws should be broken, such as where one's natural rights are at stake. So in this case, people with this type of moral reasoning would say, hey, Heinz should steal the drug to save his wife's life because her natural right to life is more important than the consequences he might face for breaking the law. And then lastly, you have level 3, stage 6, the universal ethical principle stage. And this is where individuals tend to recognize the necessities of laws. Laws are important and the democratic process is good. However, the democratic process doesn't always lead to the changes necessary to protect individuals or groups. So therefore, civil disobedience can and should be used to bring about change. So individuals who would fall into this stage would be like Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks, who fought for African American rights in the United States. I'm not going to go into it now. We got to keep moving, but I also recommend checking out the criticisms of Kohlberg because that shows up from time to time. At number 56, we have Piaget's stages of cognitive development. And let's real quickly knock these out. So the first stage is the sensory motor stage, where a child experiences the world through their five senses. And by about 8 months, kids start to develop what is known as object permanence. So in other words, a kid prior to 8 months, when they see this ball here, if you were to hide the ball from them, they would think that the ball just disappeared from existence. They don't have object permanence yet. But by the time they develop object permanence, if you hide the ball from them, they will realize, hey, the ball is underneath there. So if I just pull this off, I can still find the ball. So that happens at about 8 months. At about the same time, kids develop stranger anxiety. This is roughly the same time they start to move and crawl. In other words, they don't want to be held by someone who isn't like the parent or guardian or someone they don't know well. And that brings us to the pre-operational stage, where kids begin to use words and images to represent objects, ideas, events, and feelings, such as like, hey, that's a hot stove. That's a soft puppy. I'm mad. That's examples of what that means. Kids at this stage use pretend play, which is pretty self-explanatory. So for example, my kids think the couch is like a fire truck or a spaceship, or they like to pretend that they're superheroes. And then there's also animism and artificialism at this stage. Animism is the belief that inanimate objects have human feelings and thoughts. So if a parent knocks a teddy bear by accident off a chair, the kid might go, oh, you hurt the teddy bear. Or they may say, hey, my doll or action figure is hungry. They want to eat. Or if a child trips on the sidewalk is mean. Next up, we have artificialism, which is the belief that parts of the environment are created by people, such as like if there's thunder going on outside, a kid may believe that someone's angry and stomping their feet, and that's what's causing the thunder. Or the clouds are white because someone painted them that way. And lastly, in this stage, you have egocentrism, which is where a child assumes that other people experience, they see, they hear, they feel emotionally, they experience the world in exactly the same way they do. So, for example, let's say a dad calls home and their little kid in the pre-operational stage picks up, and the dad goes, hey, Sarah, is mommy home? And Sarah goes, and the dad goes again, hey, Sarah, is mommy home? And the kid goes, okay. And once again, the dad asks, hey, is mommy home? And Sarah's like, Dad, I told you already. Well, that's egocentrism. Sarah, in this case, assumes the dad can see exactly what she's doing when in reality he cannot. And after that, you have the concrete operational stage, where kids begin to understand conservation and use basic logic. So here we go. Here's a quick example of conservation. So first off, conservation can be defined as the awareness that physical quantities do not change in amount when they are altered in appearance. And that's the definition according to the APA. So the classic example is right here, we have containers of liquid. And if you asked a kid prior to the concrete operational stage, hey, does glass A or B have more water, or do they have the same? And the kid will respond, yeah, obviously the same. And then what they do is they take in front of the kid, right in front of the kid, they take the water in glass B and put it in glass C. And then they ask the kid, hey, which has more water, or do they have the same, A or C? And kids prior to the concrete operational stage, they don't understand conservation, will say, oh, C has more water. Okay, but once kids get to the concrete operational stage, they'll understand that physical quantities do not change even when altered in appearance. And there's other examples of this, not just with liquid, but that's conservation. Another thing that happens at this stage is logic during the concrete operational stage, which can be defined as where one draws valid conclusions after particular rules are laid out to be followed. The classic example is if A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C. And you have the rules below to come up with the answers to this phrase. So, for example, all rainy days B are cloudy days, B equals A. Tuesday is a rainy day, so C equals B. Therefore, Tuesday, C is a cloudy day, and therefore C equals A. So that's an example of logic. All right, and then lastly, you have the formal operational stage where kids begin to understand sarcasm, such as, The Last Jedi was such a good movie. Now, sarcasm is where people tend to say the opposite of what's true, often at the expense of someone else. So that's sarcasm. Also at this stage, kids begin to manipulate information and objects in their minds without seeing them. So, for example, this is not like psychic powers, but for example, this would be like doing math in your head. If you're calculating a tip in your head, you're manipulating information in your mind without seeing that information written out in front of you. Strategy formation also develops at this age. And strategy formation is planning out a course of action, especially when it comes to winning a game like Monopoly, chess, Fortnite, whatever it may be. Additionally, the ability to think abstractly develops at this stage, and abstract concepts are ideas that are not concrete or tangible. In other words, they cannot be experienced through the five senses. So, for example, abstract concept includes things like beliefs, principles, or emotions, such as like freedom, justice, honesty, truth, love, and hate. Those are all abstract thoughts that people can start to think about and understand at this stage. We also have hypothetical thinking, which includes what if questions that typically aren't based on reality. So, for example, what would you do if you could travel back in time? That is a hypothetical thought. What would you do if you won the lottery? Another hypothetical thought. And then lastly, metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. An example of metacognition would be if your math teacher said, hey, why did you try to solve the problem this way? And you go, well, I thought if I did this, and then I thought if I did that, it would lead to this. That's metacognition, thinking about thinking. And please note, as it says here, not every adult gets to this stage. And some people criticize Piaget for a couple reasons. First off, they criticize him because they think he underestimates the ability of children, and some argue that children do not learn in stages, but rather grow continuously. At number 55, we have Erikson's psychosocial development. Okay, think of the social aspect. So the first stage, real quick, is the trust versus mistrust stage. So at this stage, kids will either learn to trust the world and see that it's safe, or that it's unpredictable and that terrible things may happen. Kids may develop a sense of trust if the caregiver provides nutrition for them, protection, if the caregiver goes to them when they're crying or goes to them to change their dirty diaper on a consistent basis. And if these things happen, the child will see the world as a safe and predictable place. In other words, they will develop a sense of trust and have a hopeful outlook on the future, versus a child who doesn't receive this type of care. They will develop mistrust, which may lead them to be mistrustful of developing relationships in the future, in addition to feelings of anxiety and insecurity. The next stage is the autonomy versus shame stage. And this is where kids want to do things on their own. They don't always want to be told what to do by their parents. They want to, at this stage, pick out things like what they want to wear. I want to pick out what toy I want to play with. I want to brush my own teeth. I want to tie my own shoes. I want to choose what to eat and things like that. So if children don't get a chance to choose these types of things on their own, or if they fail or mess up while they're doing these tasks, like if they brush their teeth and they spill toothpaste everywhere, or if they're tying their shoes and it's taking too long, this can lead to feelings of inadequacy if the parents step in and scold them for going, hey, I'll just do it. I'll just tie your shoes, or why'd you make a mess? And so this leads to feelings of inadequacy. And as a result, a child may feel shame and develop low self-esteem. The next stage, the preschool age, is initiative versus guilt. And taking initiative means where one looks to take action on their own, or where one looks to take control of their environment. At the preschool age, kids, as we talked about with Piaget, pretend play. They make up games. Okay. And when kids pretend play, they assign roles and responsibilities to these made up games. And often kids will fight for who's in charge, who's going to be the leader of the group here in this make-believe scenario. And when someone kind of says, hey, I'm going to be in charge, that's an example of taking initiative. So for example, my older son, he likes to play Star Wars with his brother a lot. And oftentimes he'll make himself Darth Vader, and he'll tell his little brother, hey, you're going to be the stormtrooper. He's taking initiative, and then he'll go and boss his younger brother around to tell him what to do. Another example of taking initiative is a child taking care of a pet or toy or plant. So one other thing to understand at this stage is that if parents are too overbearing and they structure everything for their kid, that kid may never learn to take initiative on their own, or they may struggle with it in the future. Additionally, kids at this stage often ask why. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing that? Why? Okay, why does this work this way? So if a parent doesn't answer these questions or just ignores the child may feel guilty, initiative versus guilt, for asking these questions in the first place. So what a parent should do during this stage is they should praise their child for taking initiative, but at the same time, they shouldn't be overly critical when the child messes up. And that leads us to the school age, industry versus inferiority, where at this age, a child is learning how to interact with their peers at school, and they're also learning new emotional and social skills. And a lot of the things they do at this age are being measured against how other people are doing these things. So while kids interact with their classmates, they may discover, hey, I'm better at my classmate in this regard, and they're better than me in this regard. So when you do better than your peers, you're going to have feelings of industry or confidence based on their hard work, and vice versa. For example, a child may feel inferior if they're not as good as their peers at sports or at school. And this can lead to feelings of inferiority, and as a result, feelings of anxiety and depression. The identity versus role confusion stage in adolescence is pretty self-explanatory. It asks the question, who am I? Who do I want to become? Where do I fit in? How do others see me? Am I an athlete? Am I a musician? Am I an artist? Am I a loner? Should I become a doctor, an engineer? Who am I? What's my identity? Next up, during young adulthood, we have intimacy versus isolation, where one typically finds someone to settle down and enjoy life with, or they may end up being alone and isolated. The generativity versus stagnation stage in middle adulthood is all about leaving behind a legacy. So I may look that old, but I'm not in this stage because, I may look that old because I'm bald. But an example of generativity would be leaving behind these YouTube videos for you guys to pass them off to the next generation. So leaving behind something for your kids, or, for, if you don't have kids, someone else, that's an example of generativity. And then lastly, you have maturity, the maturity age, and the conflict there is integrity versus despair. And this is where one looks back at their life and says, did I do a good job? Did I do a good job leaving a legacy behind? Am I happy with who I become? So it's looking back at the past and saying, did I meet the goals that I set out to meet? Number 54, we have Gustav Fechner's absolute threshold. And as it says here, this is the minimum amount of stimulation required to trigger the sensation of touch or taste or smell or vision or hearing. Or it can be defined as the smallest detectable level of a stimulus that you're only able to detect 50% of the time. So, for example, there are times that there are going to be stimuli in the environment that exist. They're present. However, you're not going to be aware of those stimuli. In other words, they're going to be below your absolute threshold. So, for example, maybe there's a bug crawling up on your arm, but you don't feel the touch of that bug crawling on your arm because it's below your absolute threshold for touch. So, another example in regards to absolute threshold is in elementary school. I don't know if they still do this, but they used to give hearing tests. Okay. And what would happen is the person giving the hearing test would play sounds. And sometimes those sounds would be beneath your absolute threshold. So you couldn't hear them. They would be so low in volume that you couldn't hear them. And then they would start to raise the volume level. And as soon as you could hear that low level sound, that sound would have crossed your absolute threshold. Another example might be if you were to sit in a pitch black room and a researcher slowly turned up the lights. So let's say this is your absolute threshold. They slowly turned up the lights on a very sensitive dimmer switch. At some point, those lights may be on, but the intensity of those lights is so low that you're not able to detect the fact that they're on. But as soon as those lights hit a certain brightness, you will be able to tell that they're on. And at that point, the brightness has passed your absolute threshold for seeing. And note, absolute threshold has this 50% clause at the end of it, where it says the smallest detectable level of a stimulus that you're only able to detect 50% of the time. This 50% clause exists because there are going to be times, going back to the hearing test example, that we are able to hear that lowest level sound right at our absolute threshold. But there's also going to be other times we are not able to hear that same exact low level sound. And this could happen for a couple of reasons. Maybe you're not super alert. Maybe if you're really tired while taking the test, you might miss that low intensity sound right at your absolute threshold. Or maybe you're not motivated to care about the test, so you may not be really listening that hard, and you may miss that low intensity sound that you would be able to detect if you were, paying attention. Also, our expectations and experiences can impact if we detect that minimum intensity stimulus. So be sure to add that 50% clause to your definition. I don't want you to lose a point. And that ties us into the difference threshold, which is the minimum change in the intensity of a stimulus needed to detect that a change has taken place. And we're only able to detect that minimum change 50% of the time. So in this case, unlike with the absolute threshold, we are already aware of the stimulus in the environment. So for example, let's say that you notice that the lights are on in a restaurant, and you're going to a fancy restaurant, you notice the lights are on, and at some point in the night, they dim the lights. If you notice that they lowered the brightness or the intensity of the lights, then the lowering of the lights has crossed your difference threshold. Another example may be if you're at the school dance and you notice they turn up the volume or turn down the volume. If you notice that change in the intensity of sound, then it's crossed your difference threshold. Please note that the difference threshold also has this 50% clause because it's the minimum change needed to detect that a change has occurred. So for example, if the volume of a song is real low and then it gets real loud, it's going to be very easy to notice the difference in volume. However, if the change in volume is very subtle, then you might miss that change in intensity. So the difference threshold asks, what is the smallest amount of change, and in this case, volume, what is the smallest amount of change in volume needed to notice that a change has occurred at all? Or here's another example. How much more salt would you need to put on your fries for you to notice that these fries are more salty? Do you need just a little bit of salt, or do you need a lot of salt? And it's going to vary from person to person, and it also depends on the original intensity of the stimulus. And that's going to bring us to Weber's law, but we don't have enough time to go into that. So I recommend checking out Weber's law in relation to psychophysics. Number 52 is the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands are part of the endocrine system. Remember, the endocrine system is the body's slow messenger system compared to the nervous system, which sends messages or information really quickly. So the endocrine system, the body's slow messenger system. Now, once again, you should probably know all the parts of the endocrine system. However, we're going to focus on the adrenal glands here. So the adrenal glands secrete the hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine, aka adrenaline, which provide more oxygen to our muscles, which energize us to attack or flee. So adrenaline kicks in the fight or flight response. And that's important. You should know that. That is term 52. And there's more we could talk about with the endocrine system. Hans-Selye's general adaptation syndrome. This is term number 51. And this says that if there's a stressor, and here's some examples of stressors, like a family member dies, or a person finds out that they have a terminal illness, or if someone gets fired from their job, those are stressors. That will activate the alarm stage of Hans-Selye's general adaptation syndrome. So what happens when the alarm stage kicks in? Well, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. We've talked about that. What happens when the sympathetic nervous system is activated? Heart beats faster, heavy breathing, perspiration, etc. And also adrenaline is released in response to this stressor for the fight or flight response. Okay, the alarm stage eventually will lead to the resistance stage. And during the resistance stage, the body is trying to return to normal via the homeostasis process. And homeostasis is the body's default state that it functions at. So for example, if you're too hot, you're going to sweat to cool off. If you're too cold, you're going to shiver to warm up. Another example of returning to that homeostasis state would be like if you have high blood pressure, your body's going to try to lower your blood pressure. And for Hans-Selye's rats, he tested this on rats. This kicked in about 48 hours after the stressful event took place. And what's going to happen is during the resistance stage, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in. which kind of does the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to calm your breathing. It's going to calm your heart rate. It's going to lower your blood pressure. It's going to kick in to try to return you to that normal homeostasis state. Please note that some alarm stage effects will still exist during this time. And another thing to note is something from the College Board here. The College Board wants you to know, or wants you to mention, that one's physiological arousal is still going to be heightened more than normal at this stage, or that one's physiological arousal may begin to stabilize via the resistance process. Because sometimes the College Board doesn't say, hey, here's all of Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. They might say, how does the resistance stage apply to the scenario? Or how does the alarm stage apply to the scenario? So for the resistance stage, the College Board wants you to say this little note down here at the bottom. What happens next is that the body's resistance can only last for so long before exhaustion kicks in. So if the original stressor has passed, then your body's going to continue to recover. You're going to be all right. But if not, your body will no longer have the energy to deal with the stress over the long run, and it will begin to break down because it's used up so many resources trying to repair itself. And as a result, it can lead to a risk of serious illness, such as like stroke, heart disease, depression, chronic high blood pressure. It can lead to infections because your immune system is really weak. In other words, the exhaustion stage is just not good because your body begins to shut down. At number 50, we have perspective memory. This is when you remember to perform a task at the original time you intended to do that task. So for example, if you have a daily pill and you remember to take that pill daily without some alarm or reminder from your phone, that's a perspective memory. Another example of a perspective memory is if your mom or dad asks you, hey, you know what? I need you to pick up some food from the grocery store on your way home. If you remember to pick up the food from the grocery store at that time, that's a perspective memory. We have social loafing, number 49. This is when an individual puts forth less effort while working in a group than working alone. So the classic example of this is group projects. Have you guys ever experienced social loafing? Have you ever had a group partner that's, just kind of slacked off because they knew you were going to do the work? Number 48, the cocktail party effect. This is our ability to tune into a single voice from many conversations going on in a noisy room. So for example, let's say you're in the cafeteria at your school, you're talking to your friends at your table, and then across the cafeteria, you hear someone say your name. And then all of a sudden, boom, your focus goes across to the cafeteria to the person that said your name. Another example of this would be if you were at a party hanging out with your friends, and then at the party, somebody starts talking about a topic that you like. So I'm a big nerd. So, I'm hanging out in a group setting, and then across the room, someone says Star Wars. Boom. My focus is going to go on that person who said Star Wars from across the room. That is the cocktail party effect. Number 47, the neuron firing process. Okay, I'm not going to go into every little detail about the neuron firing process because there's a lot, but here's your neuron. Remember, neurons are messengers. All right, they communicate things throughout the body. So right here, we have a just basic neuron. There are different types of neurons, but this is the one the College Board wants you to know. You have the cell body, you have the dendrites. Remember, the dendrites are the receiving side. They receive chemical messages called neurotransmitters from neighboring neurons, telling it to fire or not to fire. If this neuron receives enough of the right type of chemical messengers and the threshold is met, it will fire. And this leads us to something called the all or none principle. Once that threshold is met, it doesn't matter if there's an abundance of neurotransmitters that are being sent to the dendrites of this neuron. The action potential or the firing process, that electrical signal that's going to move down this axon, is not going to be any faster once that threshold is met. Okay, so you have the axon, which is surrounded by myelin. What's the importance of myelin? Some neurons have myelin, other neurons don't have myelin. But for the neurons that do have myelin, they're going to have a faster action potential than those neurons that don't have myelin. Okay, so this action potential, this electrical neural impulse, is going to make its way down the axon to the axon terminals, also known as the terminal buttons or the terminal branches. And within these little terminal buttons, you're going to have the neurotransmitters. And they're going to be inside of these little containers called vesicles. And so that electrical signal is going to tell this neuron to release the neurotransmitters that are in the vesicles, and they're going to send that signal off to the next neurotransmitter. Okay, when a neuron is firing, it's called an action potential. When it's not firing, it's called a resting potential. It always needs to return to its resting state before firing again. And there is a process of things going in and out of the axon, but we're not going to dive into the details of that process. So that's just kind of a basic overview of the neuron firing. So the next term, number 46, is neurotransmitters. Now, I'm not going to go over every single one of these neurotransmitters with you. You guys can read this. You guys can take a screenshot if you would like. But one that seems to come up more often than not is acetylcholine. And acetylcholine does stimulate muscle contraction and deals with movement. Okay, this one seems to come up more than not. And so go ahead and check out those other ones, and you guys can take a screenshot of that. Dopamine also comes up pretty often. At number 45, we have display rules, which are the cultural rules or norms that distinguish how one should express emotion. So, for example, at a burial, in some cultures, at a funeral or burial, individuals are supposed to be very stoic. They're not supposed to show a lot of emotion. Okay. It might be okay to cry a little bit, but it's important in some cultures to kind of keep that to oneself. And in other cultures, the display rules or the norms are to wail and be very emotional and potentially rip shirts and be very outwardly expressive about one's emotions when it comes to the burial. So different cultures have different display rules, different places have different display rules depending on where you are throughout the world and even within the United States. At number 44, we have groupthink. This is when individuals in a group self-censor their beliefs in order to preserve the harmony of a group. So one example of this would be when you and your friends are going out to eat and all of your friends decide, hey, we want to go to this restaurant, but you really don't like that restaurant. However, you don't speak up because you don't want to break the harmony of the group. You don't want to upset everyone else. So you don't speak up to tell them, hey, I don't really like that restaurant. So since you don't speak up, this is an example of groupthink because you're trying to preserve the harmony of the group. Now, a more serious example of groupthink occurred when some engineers were working on the Space Shuttle Challenger. They knew that the shuttle had some potentially defective parts, but they didn't really push it too hard. And they said, you know what, we're going to let this launch happen anyway. They didn't really push to see that the parts were safe. And again, this was done to preserve the harmony of the group. And unfortunately, this led to the death of all 7 of these astronauts. At number 43, we have cognitive dissonance. This is mental strain that results from holding 2 conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes. This strain or dissonance needs to be put out or reduced. So, for example, here's just one of many examples of cognitive dissonance here. The man believes it's important to help the environment, but he drives a car that causes a lot of pollution. Okay, so he wants to help the environment, but the car causes pollution. So there's going to be dissonance. There's the difference between a behavior and a thought process here. So what can he do? Well, he can just kind of go, you know what? I'm done with the car. I'm going to get rid of it. That's one thing he could do. Or he could kind of lie to himself. He'll be like, you know what? It doesn't cause that much pollution. Or maybe it doesn't cause that much pollution when you're looking at all 8 billion people throughout the world. I'm just one person causing pollution. There's 8 billion people. No harm, no foul, no big deal. Or he could be like, you know what? On, some days I'll bike to work and on other days I'll drive the car. It's no big deal. So that is an example of cognitive dissonance. And again, people need to reduce that dissonance or strain in order to kind of justify their behaviors or thought processes. We have at number 42 schema. These are the different categories that we organize information into in our brains. So, for example, you may have schema of your different courses that you're taking at school. You may have schema of your math class, right? You may have information from your math class that you put into a category or schema, information from your science class, from your history class, from your psych class. These are all different categories that you put information into in your brain. Now, here's another example of schema. Okay, you can have a different schema for vehicles. Okay, there's a lot of different types of vehicles, so you can have schema and what I like to call sub-schema. I'm not sure if scientists or psychologists use this, but I like to use the term sub-schema. So, what are different types of vehicles? You have automobiles, and then you could have sub-schema from here. You could have pickup trucks, SUVs. You could have cars. And then you could have different types of cars. So you could have sub-schema of sub-schema of sub-schema. Ford, Tesla, Honda, Toyota, Dodge, etc. Okay, you could have planes, a different type of schema than automobiles, different types of planes. What are the different types of commercial planes? Schema for different types of jets, different types of cargo planes, etc. Haulers, big rigs, dump trucks, construction vehicles, etc. So you have different schema for all of these different things. Again, schema are categories. Number 41, a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is an expectation about a situation that impacts an individual's behavior in such a way that leads to those expectations becoming reality. So let me give you an example. All right, let's say that I'm another teacher, I'm not myself. Okay. And then another teacher comes up to me at the beginning of the year and says, "Hey, here's Jimmy. Jimmy's coming into your class and he's a bad student. He always misbehaves. He's a bad student." Well, I get this information and I assume, okay, Jimmy's a bad student. So I start treating him like a bad student from the get-go, from the beginning of the year. I start clamping down as soon as he pulls his phone out, like, "Jimmy, put your phone away. You always have your phone out." Jimmy gets more detentions or whatever. And what I'm doing is I am shaping Jimmy's behavior. And as a result, he may become a bad student because I am kind of being a jerk to him as a teacher. When in reality, maybe Jimmy just had a problem with the teacher the year before. And when that teacher comes to me, I just assume Jimmy's bad, but it was just that teacher. But now, since I'm kind of shaping Jimmy's behavior, he's going to act in a way that's kind of aggressive back towards me, and it might make him a bad student. Another example of a self-fulfilling prophecy would be if you just kind of wake up and you're going to go, "Hey, I'm just going to have a bad day. I just know it." You're going to put yourself in a situation or mindset that might lead you to have a bad day. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Number 40, the big five personality traits. You got to remember ocean kids, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So let's back up to openness here. Someone who is high in the trait of openness is open to experience. They like adventures. They're very curious. They're open to new things. Someone who is low in the trait of openness resists change. Conscientiousness, this person is very self-disciplined. They're organized, they're responsible versus someone who is not. Next up, you have extroversion. This is someone who is sociable, talkative, enjoys being around others, may have high amounts of emotional expressiveness, enjoys being around others, versus someone who is low in extroversion, otherwise known as an introvert, who this introvert might like to recharge, being alone and not being in social situations. Next up, we have the A in ocean, and that is agreeableness. Someone who is agreeable is empathetic, likes to help others, cares about others. So someone who's not agreeable, what do you think is going to happen? They tend not to care as much about others. Then lastly, we have neuroticism. Someone who is highly neurotic tends to be sensitive, tends to be nervous, tends to be stressed, worries a lot, versus someone who is low in neuroticism seem to be more secure, confident, less anxious or stressed. These come up quite a lot. Please, please, please pay attention to the big five personality traits. Canoe, I like that. Canoe works, ocean works. It doesn't matter. You just need to know all of these. Number 39, cross-sectional versus longitudinal studies. These are things that come up a lot. So let's take a look at this diagram here. Let's start on the right with a longitudinal study. And this is where a researcher studies the same group of participants year after year after year. Okay, again, it's the same group of participants. So for example, we are looking at a study on stress. So in 2022, the researcher is going to study students in sixth grade. Next year, they're going to study the same students, or ask questions of these same students about their stress levels in seventh grade. And then in 2024, they'll be in eighth grade, and it's the same students. Longitudinal studies. Okay, the downside to longitudinal studies is they can take a lot of time, and usually time is money. They can cost more. Now, on the other side, you have cross-sectional studies, and these are all types of correlational studies, by the way. Cross-sectional studies look at different groups of people all at the same time. So, for example, you're studying stress levels in 2022, you're looking at a group of sixth graders, a different group of seventh graders, a different group of eighth graders, and you're asking them questions about their stress levels all at the same exact time. The upside to this is typically, because you're doing it all at once, it tends to be cheaper, but a downside is you're not studying the same group of people over time, and the results might not be as accurate as if you were doing a longitudinal study. Okay, so longitudinal versus cross-sectional studies. Know the difference. All right, number 38. We're not diving into all of these in details, but the development stage theorists, they come up quite often. You need to know the difference between them, and you also need to know the details about each of them and all of their stages. You just got to know it. So you have Kohlberg, moral stages, Piaget's cognitive development, Erikson's psychosocial development, and Freud's psychosexual stages. Okay, so those are the stage theorists. Know them inside and out. Context-dependent, mood-congruent, and state-dependent memories. So let's start with context-dependent memories. These are memories where you have the tendency to retrieve memories that correspond to the physical setting that you're in. So, for example, let's say at prom, you are having prom in your high school gym, and you have a kiss with your significant other at the high school gym. Years and years and years go by, and you have a reunion. Okay, you go back into the high school gym, and then that memory of that kiss is triggered by you being in the same context, the same place as when that memory was formed. That's context-dependent memory. Next up, you have mood congruent memories, and this is the tendency to retrieve memories that correspond to the mood that we're in. So, for example, let's say you get in a fight with your parents tonight, and you're in an angry mood right now. And while you're in this angry mood, you recall a previous time when you were in a verbal fight with someone. It could be your parents, it could be a sibling, but that's a mood congruent memory. And then lastly, you have state dependent memories. And this is the tendency to retrieve memories that correspond to the state, such as wide awake, sleepy, drunk, high, or even a mood that we're in. So it's a little weird. State dependent memories can include these states plus moods. So that can be a little bit confusing, but that's what the APA dictionary says. So an example of a state dependent memory might be this. Bill's about to fall asleep. He's really tired. He's really sleepy, and his house catches on fire, but he gets out safely. Years later, he's reading a book in bed. He's really, really, really tired. He's sleepy again. And then while he's in that drowsy, tired state, he recalls the time that the house caught on fire. That's a mood congruent memory. Let me just say this is important. Just because you formed a memory in a specific context, mood or state, it doesn't mean that you will recall that memory in the same context, state, or mood in the future. It's not a guarantee. But there you go. You have these three. Encoding failures. So this relates to the three-stage processing model, aka the Atkinson-Shiffrin model of memory. Technically, the first stage is sensory memory, and then stage 2 is working memory. But let's talk about this for a second, a little refresher. So you have inputs. So right now, and all of the time actually, you have a ton of inputs hitting your five senses: touch, taste, smell, sight, and hearing. Okay, so right now you're watching the screen, but there's probably things that you can see in your peripheral vision behind this screen. Okay, so those are inputs hitting your eyesight, your vision. Okay, at the same time, you're probably hearing my voice, but you might also hear people in the other room. So these inputs are hitting your auditory sensation. You may hear a car drive by, other inputs. So you have tons of inputs hitting your senses all at once. In terms of touch, you might have headphones in, but you weren't paying attention to the fact that the headphones were on your ear, but now you can feel them. Now you're aware of them. Same thing with glasses on your nose or ears. Same thing with a bracelet or a watch or a ring. Same thing with socks on your feet. You weren't aware of these things until I brought them up, but all of these things are hitting your senses right now. Okay. And since there are so many things like just really impacting and crushing your senses, you have what's called the sensory memory. And the sensory memory is like a filter. It says what's important. I don't need to pay attention to the socks on my feet unless they're hurting me. I don't need to pay attention to my ring. I don't need to pay attention to my headphones or the shirt on my shoulder. So it's a filter. It filters out what's important. And along the lines of sensory memory, you have what are called iconic and echoic memory. Iconic memory deals with vision, sight that lasts for a split second and that can disappear or go to your working memory. And then echoic memory deals with sounds that can last for a second or two and that can go to your working memory or just disappear forever. And as a reminder, George Sperling is the guy who came up with that. So sensory memory is actually stage one of the three-stage processing model. Working memory is stage two. Now, let me ask you this. What is the magic number in regards to working memory? How many pieces of information can you hold in your working memory at once? Remember, your working memory is what's going on in your head right now. It's what's going on in the present. So how many pieces of information can you hold in your working memory? 2, 7 plus or minus 2. Okay, between 5 and 9. That's correct. And that's George Miller's magic number, 7 plus or minus 2. Okay, so the working memory is everything that's going on right now. It lasts for about 20 seconds unless you rehearse it. You repeat that information over and over in your head, not out loud, in your head. You rehearse it to keep it present in your working memory. And the goal is to send it to long-term memory. And you do this by encoding it into long-term memory. Well, if you never encode it, it never reaches long-term memory, so you can never retrieve it later. So that is an encoding failure when something doesn't reach long-term memory. Dealing with long-term memory, you have different types of long-term memory. You have explicit, aka declarative, with conscious recall, long-term memory, and then you have implicit, without conscious recall, long-term memory. Now, technically, the term that falls into place at number 35 is procedural memory, but I figured it would be good to show you kind of all of these things. So procedural memory does not require conscious recall. It just happens, and that is muscle memory. Okay, now on your test, we use the term procedural memory, but that is muscle memory. So an example of this would be shooting a foul shot the same way every single time, riding a bike, driving a car. You don't have to think about it. It just happens automatically without conscious recall. And then you have other types of implicit memory that happen without conscious recall that happen as a result of classical and operant conditioning. So going back to the classical and operant conditioning, for example, when you're in elementary school, your teacher kind of yells at you to raise your hand. Okay, now you raise your hand anytime a teacher calls on you. That's without conscious recall. That's an example of implicit memory. Then you have memories that are without conscious recall that come from priming. And priming, I'm not going to dive into, but priming is when something in the environment shapes your beliefs or actions. But we're not going to dive into that right now. Oh, tying your shoes, that's a great example. Riding a bike, great example. Coming over to the other side, we have explicit memory. These types of memories require conscious recall. So you have episodic memories. These are memories of events. So your last birthday party, I don't know the last time you guys had a birthday party, you may or may not have one. Maybe the last family holiday, the last fun thing you did over the summer, maybe the last concert you went to. That could have been a long time ago or recently. You have semantic memory. These are facts. Washington, D.C. is the capital of the United States. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. These are facts. Okay, so these are types of long-term memory. Mass versus distributed practice. Mass practice, you guys probably know what this is. This is cramming, and this is not something that you should do. Do not cram for this test. On the other side, you have distributed practice, and this is spacing out your studying in short intervals over a long period of time. So, for example, studying for maybe a week or two in 30-minute or hour intervals. Okay, this is more likely to lead to better memory retention, long-term memory retention than cramming. So please, please, please use this type of studying. Next up, we have schedules of reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement ask the question, when will the reinforcement occur? When will the reinforcement occur? So you have fixed. This is when the organism knows when the reinforcement will occur. And then you have variable. This is when the organism does not know when the reinforcement will occur. You have ratio. So right here we have fixed ratio. So this means that the organism knows when the reinforcement will occur, but it will happen after a certain number of instances that the behavior is performed. So for example, fixed ratio. The behavior is going to be performed 3 times, and the organism knows that after 3 times, they're going to get 1 free coffee after buying 3 free coffees. Interval is based on time. So fixed interval means that you know when the reinforcement's going to happen, and it's based after a period of time. So for example, a rat hits a lever, and then 30 seconds later, it gets a food reward. Or as an adult, you typically, work 5 days a week, and every 2 weeks you get paid. You know when the reinforcement is going to happen, and it happens after a certain period of time. Then you have variable ratio. Variable, you don't know when the reinforcement is going to happen, and it's going to happen after a certain number of instances that the behavior is performed. Now, note this, you must do the behavior in order to get the reinforcement. With variable ratio, you must do the behavior in order to get the reinforcement. So playing the slot machine, you must put the money in, pull the lever. Don't recommend it. You're going to lose a lot of money that way, but you must pull the lever each time before you can potentially get the reinforcement, get the reward of winning the slot machine. You must do the behavior in order to be rewarded. Now, with a variable interval, you don't know when the reinforcement is going to happen, and it's going to be after a period of time. Now, with variable interval, you do not have to do the behavior for the reinforcement to arrive. So, for example, a surfer waiting for the perfect wave. A surfer waiting for the perfect wave, okay? That surfer can be waiting for the perfect wave, and they might go home realizing, the perfect wave didn't arrive, and that night that perfect wave arrives, okay? So the surfer waiting for the perfect wave is an example of variable interval because you don't know when that perfect wave is going to arrive. We have convergent and divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is finding one best solution. Thinking of convergent coming together. One best solution. An example of this is a multiple choice test. Next up, you have divergent thinking, which is finding creative or multiple solutions. Here's an example of divergent thinking. How many uses can you come up with for a quarter? Or what are some different ways that you can earn some money to buy a car? There's many different things that you can use a quarter for. And if you come up with a lot of different solutions, this is an example. Next up, we have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, and I got a little video for you that will explain this real quick.
Scholars, today we're going to go over the different parts of the nervous system. The first thing we're going to look at is the difference between the central and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and spinal cord, the brain being the control center of the body, and the spinal cord being the information highway that sends messages to and from the brain and to and from the rest of the body. Next up, we have the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of nerves that branch off of the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is divided into 2 parts called the somatic and autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system controls voluntary movement via the use of our skeletal muscles. In addition to motor nerves, it contains sensory nerves as well. For example, if you hit your finger with a hammer, that's going to be detected by the somatic nervous system and sent to your brain for processing. Next up, we have the autonomic nervous system, which controls our digestive, respiratory, circulatory, and reproductive functions. The autonomic nervous system is split into 2 parts, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is our body's alert system that responds to stressors, which includes anything from running away from a guy with a chainsaw to the physiological arousal that takes place while you're playing a sport or taking a test. When the sympathetic nervous system is active, our heart rate accelerates, noradrenaline is released for the fight or flight response, digestion slows down to conserve energy, our pupils dilate, and more. On the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. It calms the body down after a stressful situation. For example, the heart rate slows down, digestion picks back up, the pupils constrict, and more. So the question remains, when this guy yeeted his golf club into the stratosphere, did the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system kick in the second the club left his hands?
Okay, so did the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system kick in when the club left that guy's hands? And if you said the sympathetic nervous system, that is the correct answer. So that's the nervous system that deals with arousal and stressful events, sympathetic nervous system. At number 30, you need to know everything about vision and the eye. And we don't have time to go into all the details, but I can summarize them for you. So you need to know all the parts of the eye. You need to know how images in the environment are seen and processed by the eye and brain. You need to know about rods and cones. They are photoreceptor cells. You need to know that rods see black and white images, and rods detect images in low light, and cones see color. Use the alliteration there, cones color. You need to know about transduction. Transduction is the conversion of one form of energy into another form of energy. You need to know about depth perception. We have two eyes. Our two eyes see technically two different images. Okay, our two eyes don't see just straight on. One eye sees straight and the other one sees kind of at an angle. I'm over exaggerating here. Okay, our eyes see two different images, and that gets sent back to our occipital lobe where the visual cortex is, and our brain puts those two images together to kind of form a single image. But because we have two eyes that see two different images, it allows us to see depth or distance. The things we've been talking about in terms of depth relate to monocular and binocular cues from the sensation and perception unit. You need to know those as well. You need to know about the blind spot that is caused by the optic nerve exiting the eye. You need to know about nearsightedness, myopia, farsightedness, hyperopia. You need to know the difference between the trichromatic theory of color and the opponent processing theory of color. That also includes after images. That's important. You need to know about how different wavelengths of light are perceived as different colors. You need to know about feature detectors that detect color, motion, form, depth. You need to know about how images in the environment are detected by specific parts of each eye and which hemisphere of the brain processes what each eye sees. You need to know how split brain patients process visual information. In summary, you need to know everything about the eye and vision. You also need to know about the different parts of the brain, how they function, neurons, the ear, tongue, nose, everything dealing with touch as well. By the way, here's a bonus question. Every one of our five senses is processed by the thalamus, except which sense? What is the one sense that is not processed by the thalamus? There it is, smell. You also need to know the parts of the brain. Now, we're not going to go into all the parts of the brain. Technically, at number 29, the term that fell here was the prefrontal cortex, but I thought it would be important to talk about the cerebrum, or this outer layer of the brain with the different lobes of the brain. Now, as a reminder, you guys hopefully know this by now, but here's the cerebrum. Here's the outer layer of the brain over here. Remember, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. And then you have the different lobes on each hemisphere. You have the frontal lobe, which is split into, at least what we need to know, the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is for decision making. What also exists in the prefrontal cortex is our personality. And the reason we know this is because of that guy, Phineas Gage, who had the rod go through his prefrontal cortex, and it completely knocked out his personality or changed his personality. Courtney asked, do we need to know about the midbrain, forebrain, and hindbrain? Yeah, we need to know about all that, but I'm just going to go over the outer layer of the brain here. You need to know about all that other stuff as well. The motor cortex, that's muscle movement. It's kind of this strip right here of the brain. Then you have the parietal lobe, which includes the somatosensory cortex. That's your touch sensations. That's located right here. Just follow where my mouse is. The parietal lobe also processes numbers in the left hemisphere, and in the right hemisphere, it processes spatial information. So, for example, Lamar Jackson is the quarterback of the Baltimore Ravens. When he sees defenders coming at him, he's going to process that information. Oh, here's a defender here, here's a defender here. I need to go around those defenders. That is spatial information that's processed by the right hemisphere of the parietal lobe. Next up, we have the occipital lobe and the visual cortex. Vision's processed there, and then you have the temporal lobe, and that's where sound is processed. Again, guys, there are other parts of the brain, but we're not going into all the details here. We're just going over the outer layer. You got to know the other parts of the brain as well. Next up, we have social facilitation versus social inhibition. Social facilitation is the tendency for one to perform easy or well-learned tasks better in the presence of others. Think of an athlete. An athlete at practice is probably going to perform really well, a pro athlete. But at a game in front of a crowd that's going to pump them up, they're probably going to perform better because the crowd's cheering them on. That's social facilitation, performing better in the presence of others. And on the other hand, you have social inhibition, which is the tendency for one to perform more difficult or less practice tasks more poorly in the presence of others. So, for example, if you don't give speeches that often, and then, your teacher asks you to give a speech, you may be nervous, you may freeze up, and you may do poorly in the presence of others when, back at home, you did fine, in front of your mirror. We have the Yerkes-Dodson law. The Yerkes-Dodson law states we perform our best at a moderate level of arousal. If the level of arousal is too high, we're going to be stressed or anxious and our performance decreases. And if it's too low, our performance will also decrease. So let me give you an example. Let's say your coach looks at you and says, hey, you're taking the last shot of the game here. All right, you got to hit this or we lose. You got to take the last shot. If you're going to get too stressed or anxious, your performance is going to decrease. If you start kind of freaking out about taking this last shot, your performance is going to decrease. On the other hand, okay, if you're half awake taking a test or something like that, you're going to have bad performance as well. Or you could also be freaking out about the test and your performance can go down. Okay, so let's say, you stayed up all night studying for a test. Okay, you're going to be asleep and therefore not aroused, and your performance is going to decrease as a result. So we perform our best at a moderate level. We have operant conditioning. Now, couple key terms here, positive and negative. Remember, positive does not mean good and negative does not mean bad. Positive means the addition of something and negative means the removal of something. Then you have reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement is when someone attempts to get a behavior to occur again, and punishment is an attempt to stop a behavior. So let's look at this chart. Positive reinforcement is where rewards are given in order to get a behavior to occur again. So an example of this would be like your teacher saying, hey, good job for raising your hand. Okay, the behavior is raising your hand. The teacher wants you to get your hand to be raised again. They're rewarding that behavior, reinforcing that behavior by saying good job. Negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimulus. So for example, let's say you turn on the car, but you haven't put your seatbelt on yet. Not recommending it, but let's say that happens. Well, what's going to happen? The car is going to start dinging at you. Ding, 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 ding. And what you're going to do is to get rid of that annoying sound, that aversive stimulus, you are going to put your seatbelt on. Another example of this would be like, hey, I have a headache. And to quell that headache, I'm going to take Tylenol. Okay, that would be an example of negative reinforcement. Next up, you have positive punishment. This is where there's the addition of something unpleasant in order to stop a behavior. An example of this would be you come home late, you miss your curfew, and your parents are like, hey, you have to do some extra chores. It's the addition of the extra chores that you have to do, and the behavior that they're trying to stop is you arriving home late. Another example would be a speeding ticket. If you receive a speeding ticket, that's a positive punishment. Remember, positive does not mean good. Next up, we have negative punishment, and this is the removal of something pleasant in order to stop a behavior. Let's say you're using your phone in class and your teacher takes your phone. They're removing something pleasant in order to stop you from using your phone in class. Anytime someone, a little kid receives a timeout, or you receive a detention, or let's say you are grounded, anytime your freedom is taken away, that is a negative punishment. Fluid versus crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the ability to solve new problems and reason abstractly, and it decreases with age. So, an example of this would be a lawyer thinking quickly on their feet when the opposing side makes a good argument. If you're able to come up with a rebuttal very quickly, that's an example of fluid intelligence. Solving new problems that haven't been solved before, new puzzles or new problems. Maybe escape rooms might be an example of fluid intelligence. Oftentimes, when you give an old person a new piece of technology like an iPad or a phone, they really struggle with it. That's an example of fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence fades away over time, and it's okay. I'm old myself. I'm balding, so I can say things like that, right? Then we have crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is the accumulation of facts, knowledge, and skills over a lifetime, and this increases with age. So for me, when I get old, facts that I'll still retain are facts about psychology, facts about history, facts about Star Wars. Again, I'm a nerd. Okay, so here's a graph that shows the difference between crystallized and fluid intelligence. Remember, fluid intelligence fades away. Use that alliteration there. Your English teacher will be pumped. And this was created by a guy named Raymond Cattell. Next up, we have de-individuation. This is kind of like the psychology term for mob mentality. We don't use that term in psychology, but de-individuation is when a group setting causes one to lose someone's self-awareness and they abandon their normal restraints. In other words, the group setting causes them to do things that they would not normally do if it were not for the group. So, examples of this: the good kid who never gets in trouble, but there's a food fight in school. Everybody's involved in the food fight and they decide to get involved in the food fight. The guy who never gets mad starts yelling ref at the football game. Okay, he starts yelling at the ref for making a terrible call at the football game in this large crowd of people. Hey, everybody else is yelling, I can yell. This diffusion of responsibility, this feeling of anonymity. I'm not going to be called out here. I'm not going to get in trouble. This is why people do things in group settings that they wouldn't normally do. By the way, after the Rams won the Super Bowl, even though they won, there were some people in LA who were jumping on buses. They were climbing up telephone poles. That's de-individuation. Okay, this group mentality, this feeling of anonymity, that is de-individuation. 23, we have self-efficacy. This seems to come up a lot. This is how capable or confident a person feels in their ability to complete a task. So if you feel super confident that you're going to get a 5 on the AP test, you have a high self-efficacy. Or if your coach asks you to take that last shot in the basketball game or the soccer game or whatever, and you think you're going to hit it, that's a high self-efficacy. If you don't think you're going to hit it, that's a low self-efficacy. Is someone who loves to solve math problems more likely a high school student or a college math professor? Also, what percentage of crimes in the US involve violence? When you were answering these questions, you were using what are called heuristics, and heuristics are a type of bias. Heuristics can be defined as a rule of thumb strategy for making quick gut decisions. And there are 2 types of heuristics that you need to know. And again, these are a bias to solving problems. So let's go to question number 1 here. Is someone who loves to solve math problems more likely a high school student or a math professor? Now, if you actually do back of the napkin math here, I'll give you these numbers. There are about 27,000 high schools in the US. We're going to assume that there are about 15 math teachers at each of these high schools. And each of these math teachers teaches 5 classes. And we're going to make the assumption that just one student in each of their classes loves math. Now, in some classes, it might be less. In some classes, it might be way more. Okay, we're going to make the assumption that one student loves math. If you do the calculation here, it's going to turn out to be 2,025,000 high school students who love math. And on the other side, there are about 5,000 colleges in the US, and we'll say there are about 25 math professors at each college, and we'll assume they all love math because they're teaching it. If you do the math here, this turns out to be 125,000 professors who love math. So going back to this question, is someone who loves to solve math problems more likely a high school student or a math professor? Well, the answer is a high school student. So if you said a math professor, the heuristics your heuristics led you to get a wrong answer. And this is an example of the representative heuristic, which is a rule of thumb strategy used to make quick decisions based off of stereotypes of a group. Representative heuristics, that's the math versus high school student one. Then going to the question, what percentage of crimes in the US involve violence? So here are the FBI crime stats. Here we go. About 25% of the crimes in the US involve violence. If you said more than 25, why did you say more than 25? Well, oftentimes on TV or social media, what do they show you? They show you all the crimes that involve violence because that's what makes news. That's what gets viewers. So if you estimate it over 25%, a lot of people are saying 50%, 60% or higher, that was due to what is called the availability heuristic. This is a rule of thumb strategy used to make quick decisions based off of information that comes to mind easily. For example, what percentage of crimes involve violence? And here's another example. Someone decides to buy a lottery ticket because they've heard a lot of people were winning the lottery in their area. Okay, so they buy a lottery ticket because they think they're going to win as well because it comes to mind easily. They see it a lot. They see it regularly. Again, heuristics are a bias and it can lead you to the right answer, but it may lead you to a wrong answer. So this is what I was just saying. Heuristics can lead us to make mistakes because we're making quick judgment calls. However, they can also lead us to the right answer. Now, what is the opposite of heuristics? An algorithm. It's slow, but it will always lead you to the right answer. Next up, number 21, we have intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is where the desire to perform a task comes from within the individual. So for example, let's say someone really loves a sport and loves playing the sport for the sake of that sport, or someone really loves to play an instrument for the sake of that instrument. That's intrinsic motivation. On the other hand, you have extrinsic motivation, and this is the desire to perform a task, and it comes from outside the individual. It's an external reward. So for example, if someone plays basketball their whole life and then they go on to the NBA and they get paid and now they like the money more than playing the game for the sake of the game, they are now extrinsically motivated. Okay, so like money is an extrinsic motivator. Now, this leads us to something called incentive motivation. This is another kind of term that comes up a lot on the FRQs. Incentive motivation is pretty self-explanatory. It's when people are led to do things based off of rewards and discouraged from doing other things based off of punishments. The over-justification effect. And this is a phenomenon in which a person becomes less internally motivated to pursue an activity after they are rewarded for something that they already love to do. So let me give you an example here. There was a study where there were a bunch of kids and they loved doing puzzles. They were intrinsically motivated to do puzzles. And then they were given rewards for completing the puzzles, okay, after a few weeks or whatever it was. They started getting like stickers or stars or something for completing the puzzle. But once the rewards were taken away after they had received them, these kids didn't like doing the puzzles as much as they originally did. Okay, at first, they loved them. They were intrinsically motivated to do them. Okay, then they got the extrinsic reward and they cared more about the extrinsic reward, the stickers or whatever, and then they became less internally motivated to complete that task. We have conformity. Conformity is pretty self-explanatory. Someone changes their behavior to fit in with a group. Now, this goes back to Ash's line experiment, where he sent a participant into a room filled with other participants. But the truth was that these other participants were in on it. They were working for Ash. They were Confederates who were helping Ash out. However, the real participant didn't know this. So in this example, all of these guys right here with the red arrows, they were Confederates working for Ash. And this is the one real participant. And so what happened is a lab assistant or Ash showed all these participants a series of slides that looked like this. And they would say, okay, which line on the right matches the line on the left? And the answer here is pretty obvious. Line 2 matches the line over here on the left. And then they would show another slide and ask a similar question. Eventually, what happened is at one point during the experiment, the Confederates working for Ash would intentionally give a wrong answer. They would say something like line 3 matches line X. Okay, so they would say, oh, line 3 matches line X when it doesn't. Line 3 matches line X. Line 3 matches line X. Line 3 matches line X. So then it became the actual participant's turn. And then they had to give an answer. Are they going to conform? Are they going to go along with the group? Or are they going to give the right answer? Line 2 actually matches with line X. And what's wild is that about 33% of the time, the participant conformed and went along with the group. So the question that must be asked is why? Why does this happen? Okay. And this leads us to normative social influence and informational social influence. So let's talk about normative social influence first. This is when somebody conforms because they want to fit in with a group. They may not agree with a group. Okay. They may not agree that line 3 matches line X. They may not agree, but they don't want to be made fun of. They don't want to stick out. They don't want to get laughed at. So I think of normative social influence. Here's my little mnemonic device. Normative social influence. Nobody likes you. Normative, no, nobody likes you. So you don't want to stick out. So you're just going to go along with the group for the sake of going along with the group. Informational social influence is when someone conforms because they think the group is actually right. Okay. They think the group has more knowledge or information than they do. So they conform with what the group says. They think the group's right and they go, I'm going to follow the group in that case. Next up, we're going to talk about proactive versus retroactive interference. And this is one example of a retrieval failure. Okay, remember, working memory is everything that's going on in our mind right now, and we're retrieving that information from long-term memory into working memory. So I'm about to give you an acronym, and in no way, shape, or form do I support what the acronym means. But remember, weird and wild acronyms stick out in your mind, and you're more likely to remember those things. Not a proponent of this thing, but here's the weird and wild acronym, and that is PORN. Okay, proactive and retroactive interference. Proactive interference is when old information interferes with new information. Old information interferes with the recall of new information. So, for example, let's say you just got a new significant other and you called them by your old significant other's name. That old information is interfering with the new significant other's name, and now you don't have a significant other at all. Okay, so proactive interference, old information interfering with new information. Then there is retroactive interference. This is where new information interferes with the recall of old information. So, for example, let's say you just got a new job. Let's say you're adulting, you just got a new job, you just had an old job, you just got a new one. Okay, and you have a new boss. Okay, one day you're walking around, going shopping, whatever it is, you go into the store and you see your old boss. And you're like, hey, you say hi to your old boss and you call him by your new boss's name. That is retroactive interference. Okay, and that is going to get you in trouble with your old boss there when new information interferes with old information. There you go. There's your acronym. That's how you remember it. Next up, we have observational learning, social learning, theory, modeling. They're all roughly the same thing. This is the number one term that's not from the research method that shows up on the AP Psych FRQ. Okay, this was created by Bandura and Bandura's Bobo dolls. Remember, Bandura showed kids an adult playing with a Bobo doll, this kind of thing that you could hit, and once you hit it, it kind of bounced around. And what would end up happening is some adults played nicely with the Bobo doll, and the kids saw that, and some adults played aggressively and hit the Bobo doll. And so the question remains, how did the kids respond? Okay, the kids who saw the adults playing nicely played nicely. The kids who saw the adults playing aggressively with the Bobo doll played aggressively with the Bobo doll. So these terms, observational learning, social learning theory, modeling, all mean this is when a individual learns how to behave by watching or observing others. That's what that means. Okay, this shows up all the time. Okay, we are moving on to kind of the research design terms. We are on term, I guess, 17 now. Okay, so the top 17 terms all come from the research design unit. And that makes sense because one FRQ is based solely on the research design unit. And that means roughly 16% of the test is coming from the research design unit. And that's important to understand. Now, note, these last few terms, they aren't technically in numerical order. I put them in an order that made sense to talk about, because if I kind of put them out of order, then it would just kind of get confusing. So like things like independent and dependent variable, those terms show up. I think they're, the top three, two of the top three terms that show up all the time. But I didn't put them at number 1 or number 2 or number 3. Okay. So I put them in an order that made sense to talk about them and not numerical sense. Number 17, we have the different types of research methods. We have a case study. I'll briefly kind of talk about these. A case study is where a researcher studies a unique case of one individual or a small group of individuals. Okay, one individual or small group of individuals, and it's usually a unique case. So for example, remember Jeannie. You guys probably watched a video about Jeannie. She was locked in a room by her parents, wasn't treated right. She was abused. And as a result, when she was found years later, she had a lot of developmental delays. Jeannie would be an example of a case study because a bunch of researchers worked with Jeannie, and there was obviously some controversy involved there, but Jeannie is an example of a case study. Another example of a case study is patient HM. Patient HM is the guy who had a bunch of seizures. So he had his hippocampus removed, and then he couldn't form any new memories because remember, the hippocampus is where memories are formed. And the guy who performed the surgery sucked out his hippocampus, putting a kind of like a straw behind his eyeballs to suck it out. Okay, next up, we have a survey. A survey is when, you guys know what a survey is, when people self-report information. So for example, let's say you want to do a survey about the percentage of students who use cell phones in class, or the amount of time they spend using their cell phones in class. That would be an example of a survey. Naturalistic observation is when a researcher records behavior in a naturally occurring setting without trying to get involved or manipulate the setting or the variables. Okay. For example, a researcher might get permission from a school and parents to go observe how kids interact at recess. Okay. And they're not going to get involved. They're not going to talk to the kids. They're just going to observe, hey, was that a positive interaction or a negative interaction? Then you have a correlation. A correlation looks at relationships. So here are examples of correlations. All right, here's a positive correlation. As height increases, weight increases. Here's an example of a negative correlation. Time spent studying and the amount of sleep you get. And then there's no correlation with this, the color of the car and miles per gallon. Okay, so correlation, relationships, and as you know, correlation does not imply causation. If you see correlation on an FRQ, that's probably the first thing you should write down after the word correlation. Correlation does not imply causation. And here's an example of why. I got this was going around Twitter. All right, as ice cream sales increase as it gets warmer out, so does violent crime. And as ice cream sales decrease as it gets colder, so does violent crime. So do people who eat ice cream commit violent crime? Probably not. So correlation does not imply causation. And the only thing that does are experiments. Experiments can prove cause and effect. So know this inside and out. All right. Now, let's briefly talk about some kind of upsides and downsides of each of these, and then we'll move on. The downsides of a case study is it's not generalizable. So think about Jeannie or patient HM. You can't generalize it on the whole population. And all of these don't prove causation except for an experiment. Okay, with a survey, upside is you can collect a lot of data, and it's relatively cheap because you can collect so much data from so many people. The downside is if a survey sample isn't large enough, or if there are too many confounding variables, the data reported might be hard to generalize, especially if you don't use a random sample. Generalization goes along with random sampling, which we'll talk about in a second. There's also bias with surveys. You have social desirability bias, where people give answers to make themselves look good. So, for example, if there was a question like, do you donate to people in need? A lot of people might say yes because they don't want to look bad. There's also volunteer bias, where the people who volunteer for the survey may not be part of the participant group. Okay, so that is a downside to surveys. All right, with naturalistic observation, the downside is it describes behavior but does not explain it. And then, of course, with correlations do not imply causation. Number 15, a researcher should seek to obtain a random sample when selecting participants. So here's our population. Let's say you want to get a random sample. What you can do is you can take everybody in the population and put their names in a hat and start drawing names out until you have your sample, okay, which is going to be smaller than the whole population. That's one way of doing it. Another way to get a random sample is assigning every participant a number and then have a random number generator from a computer spit out numbers until you get your sample. Okay, if you see random sampling or sampling on your FRQ, you may have to explain how it's done. So using a random number generator or using the names in the hat are a good way of getting a random sample. Number 14, using a random sample allows a researcher to make generalization or inferences from the data. So, for example, let's say this population right here represents all the students at your high school, and you want to survey them about, who uses their cell phone in class. Okay, so you get your random sample, as we talked about earlier, and you survey your sample. And the reason you survey your sample and not everyone is because it would take too much time to survey every single student. And in a bigger study, it would cost a lot. So it's a time and money issue. That's why you get a smaller sample. Okay. And you ask this sample about their cell phone usage in class. And you're going to ask them, how many of you use your cell phone in class? And let's say that 75% of the sample of the participants say that they use their phone in class. Then what you can do is you can take that and generalize it on the larger population. You can say, because 75% of the students in my sample use their phone in class, then approximately 75% of all of the students in my school within a margin of error use their phones in class. Okay, random samples allow for generalizations. You need to know that. Now, a great thing is you do not need to know how to calculate margins of error for AP Psych. So that's a good thing. Number 13, we have experiments. This is a research method in which an experimenter can determine cause and effect through the manipulation of an independent variable. A hypothesis is an educated guess. It's a prediction. Please write your hypothesis in if-then statements. That's going to help. So here's an example hypothesis that we're going to come back to. If students drink caffeine before a test, or then their test score will improve. Okay, it's a guess. All right. There's the independent variable is the amount of caffeine you're going to be giving the students, and the dependent variable is their test scores will improve. Again, independent variable is the variable which is manipulated by the researcher, and the dependent variable is what's being measured. Okay, so the amount of caffeine that's being given. These terms are probably the top 2 or 3 that show up the most often, but we're going in more of a logical order and not numerical order here. Okay, next up, number 9, we have confounding third or lurking variables. A confounding variable is an extraneous variable whose presence affects the variables being studied, so the results you get do not reflect the actual relationship between the independent and dependent variables. So what might be some confounding variables in regards to our study about caffeine and test scores be? Okay, amount of sleep the students get. What about time spent studying? Times the test takings in the morning, is in the afternoon? Okay, these are all good examples of confounding variable. Okay, so confounding variables can impact the study, and with confounding variables, you might not be able to prove A causes B. Operational definitions. Number 8, operational definitions are detailed descriptions of the steps, variables, and procedures throughout the study. So you want to really explain what the independent variables is. So the amount of caffeine, well, how much caffeine are you giving? You got to be specific. You don't want to say, a cup of coffee, because different types of coffee have different amounts of caffeine. So you want to say exactly how much caffeine you're going to give. Okay. You want to say exactly when the test should be taken. You're going to say how much time the students are allowed to study before the test. You also want to say things like how much time before the test should they drink the caffeine. All of these things matter and could have an impact on the results. So you want to operationalize or define very specifically your variables. And oftentimes, as you know, in the FRQs, they're going to ask you for you to operationalize or operationally define terms. They'll say something like operationally define the independent variable or operationally define the dependent variable. And what you want to include is an amount or a time or change. Okay. So for example, all right, exactly how much caffeine, the amount, how much caffeine and how long before the test, time. And then the dependent variable is typically the change. Okay. Test scores will improve. Well, how much will the test scores improve by? Are we talking about a point? Are we talking about a letter grade? You want to identify specifically how much or how big that change is going to be. Number 7, reliability versus validity. Reliability versus validity. Reliability is all about replication. The reason you use operational definitions is so your experiment can be repeated by someone else. If your experiment can't be repeated and someone else can't get the same results, what good are your results? Okay, that's why operational definitions are important. Validity. Did the researcher measure what they set out to measure? So, for example, if your psych teacher truly wants to know your knowledge of AP psychology, but they give you an AP calculus test as your psych final, is that a valid tool? Is that a valid way to measure how much you know about psychology? Obviously not. So, validity, using the right tools. Did the researcher measure what they set out to measure? And you got to use the right tools to do that. Number 6, random assignment. Random assignment is really important. It comes up all the time. Don't mix up random assignment and random sampling. Random assignment is once you have your sample or your participants and you assign them randomly to the experimental or the control group. And you want to explain how you do that. So this can be done by, again, pulling names out of a hat. Okay, we have 8 participants here. The first 4 names we pull out of a hat will go into the experimental group. The second 4 names will go into the control group. Okay, and again, what's the difference between the experimental and the control groups? The experimental group receives the treatment and the control group receives a placebo or a dummy or a lookalike treatment or substance. The reason you have a control group is why? It's because you want to compare the experiment, the treatment against the control group to see if it actually works. That's very, very, very important. Okay, that's very important. Now, let's get back to the reason for random assignment. The reason you randomly assign is because you want the groups to have equal representation. And let me explain. There are things called participant or subject variables, which are like confounding variables, which have to deal with person's sex, their age, height, weight, skill level, intelligence, prior knowledge. Again, they're like confounding variables that can influence the results. And so, for example, you don't want to have a control group of all males and a experimental group of all females. Okay. You don't want to have a control group of low intelligent people and experimental group of high intelligent people. You want to have equal representation in both the control and the experimental group. Okay. Males and females, low and high intelligence in both groups. Okay. Because things like confounding variables, participant and subject variables may bias the results. So the purpose of random assignment, again, is to make the groups identical and to reduce confounding and subject variables. That's important. Now, you may be asking, why do these participants have blindfolds on? Well, this leads us to a single blind study. And a single blind study is where participants don't know if they're in the control group or the experimental group. However, the researcher does a single blind study. And the reason you do a single blind study is to reduce errors. since some participants might behave in a way that could impact the results if they knew that they were receiving the placebo or the actual treatment. So, for example, when they were doing the trials for the COVID vaccine, if participants knew they were in the experimental group, if they knew they were getting the treatment, they may go out and put themselves in settings where there are a lot of people thinking the vaccine would protect them. And then if participants knew that they were in the control group, they may put themselves in settings without people. They might just stay isolated and inside their homes. And so you have two groups, one that's going out a lot and seeing a lot of people, and another group that's not seeing a lot of people and they're staying inside their homes. And then you can't really compare how effective the results are because of those behaviors. So it's important for the participants to not know whether they're in the experimental or control group. Okay, so random assignment, again, is used to make sure representation and the general behavior of both the experimental and control group is the same. And a blind study is to make sure participants don't behave in a way that we talked about a second ago. Let's real quickly talk about a double-blind experiment. This is when the researcher and the participant don't know who's in what group. And this is important. A double-blind experiment, the reason they do this is because it prevents bias, reduces researcher bias. And what do I mean by this? Well, if I was doing a research study that I spent years and years and years on, and my company poured millions of dollars into, I may be inclined to look for pieces of data that support that my drug works, or I may ask questions that shape participant answers or behaviors to make it look like my hypothesis is correct. And that's not good. You don't want that. So in a double-blind study, a third party randomly assigns participants to either a control or experimental group, and the researcher doesn't know who's in what group. They just look at the results, and then at the very end, they're told, hey, this is the experimental group, and this is the control group. Again, it prevents researcher bias. That's really important to know, and you should write it down on your test if it comes up. Okay, so here's term number 5, 4, and 3. We just went over these. Here is the scoring guidelines from the 2014 AP Psych FRQ on research design. And it says, explain why the researchers can conclude that there is a cause and effect relationship between the independent and dependent variables. You could say one of three things. The student can earn this point by indicating that participants were randomly assigned. Remember, random assignment eliminates confounding variables so that a researcher can prove that A caused B. B says the student identifies the study as an experiment. All you had to say for this term here is the reason why the researcher can conclude that there is a cause and effect relationship in this experiment in the prompt in the FRQ is because it's an experiment. That's all you have to say. It's an experiment. That's it. Experiments prove cause and effect. And then C, you could have also said that the researcher manipulated the independent variable in the study. Any of those would score and indicate cause and effect, which is important. And again, don't confuse random sampling and random assignment. Random sampling is when you have your population, and from that population, you draw your sample. And once you have your sample, you can take the sample as your participants and then randomly assign them to both the control group and the experimental group for random assignment. Don't confuse sampling and assignment. Number 2, we have statistical significance. We're going to watch 2 quick videos on this.
Let's go over a term that comes up all the time on the AP Psych test, and that is statistical significance, which just means the results of a study did not likely occur by chance. And that's a really good thing. Let me explain. Let's say that a researcher wants to study the effects of a new weight loss pill on 2 groups. Group A, who takes the pill and ends up losing on average 5 pounds, and Group B, aka the control group, who is given a placebo and ends up losing on average 2 pounds. So the questions that must be asked now are, did the experimental drug truly help Group A lose 3 more pounds on average than Group B, or did people in Group A lose more weight simply by chance? In other words, did something other than the pill, such as unaccounted for exercising or dieting, or maybe even faster metabolisms, cause members of Group A to lose more weight? If the experimenter controlled for the confounding variables that I just mentioned, and the results weren't reached by pure luck or chance, i.e. the weight loss pill truly caused Group A to lose more weight on average than Group B, then the findings are statistically significant.
And remember, random assignment helps with this. All right, here's part 2.
I just wanted to mention a few more things about statistical significance that I wasn't able to cover in my last video. As a reminder, a statistically significant study is one in which the results did not likely occur by chance. And if you see this term on an FRQ, you should write this definition down right away. What's important for you to understand is that there is something that researchers calculate called a p-value, which indicates whether or not the results of an experiment are statistically significant. The good thing is that you won't have to know how to calculate this for the AP test. What you do need to know, however, is that a p-value is a numerical value between 0 and 1. And the closer a p-value is to 0, the more statistically significant the results are. Here's how researchers break it down. If p is less than 0.05, the results are statistically significant. And if p is greater than 0.05, the results are not statistically significant.
All right. Statistical significance. Make sure you know that one, guys. That one comes up all the time. Another way you could say something is statistically significant is this: there is a high probability that the independent variable caused changes in the dependent variable. That would also score as well. Or the results did not occur by chance. That's really important for researchers. We got ethical concerns. So got one more real quick video on ethical concerns. And then even after we talk about ethical concerns, I got some other real quick tips.
Let's go over something that the AP Psych Research Methods FRQ asks students to do all the time, and that is to identify and correct ethical flaws in a study. The first ethical guideline to watch out for is that a researcher can't coerce participants into their study, i.e., a researcher can't force someone to participate in their study, and subjects must be allowed to quit anytime they want. Next, there must be informed consent, which means the participants must understand and agree to the fact that they are going to participate in a study, and they also need to be warned about the potential risks that they may face, which cannot be too severe and that they cannot cause long-term negative physical or mental effects. In other words, a researcher must protect participants from harm and discomfort. It's also important to understand that a researcher is allowed to deceive or lie to subjects as long as they debrief them at the end of the study. The last major ethical guideline that researchers must follow is confidentiality. In other words, the researcher must not identify who the participants are when publishing the results. All right, All-Stars, make sure you know these ethical guidelines because they show up on the Research Methods FRQ all the time.
A few more tips before we wrap up this video. Please take practice tests. Ask your teacher for practice tests. Use the AP Classroom or the AP Portal. Your teacher will have quizzes for you available there. Please use those. I find that kids who use the practice test in AP Portal tend to do better. There's a correlation between kids who use the AP Portal and their scores on the unit test in my class and their scores on the AP test. There's a correlation there. So take practice tests, practice FRQs, practice multiple choice, practice everything. Be careful using someone else's Quizlet. Okay, be careful using someone else's Quizlet. A couple reasons. One, they may not have all the terms. Two, their definitions can be wrong. I'm an old school guy. I like using flashcards. I think it helps better when you write things out by hand. But even if you're going to make your own Quizlet, having that extra rehearsal, that extra repetition is super, super helpful. There may be terms on the test that you don't know, and that's okay. Secure your points. Focus on the terms that you do know. Secure your points. Skip over the terms you don't. There's usually one term on the FRQ every year that a lot of kids don't know throughout the nation, and that's okay. Okay, that's okay. Secure your points elsewhere. Next up, the Research Method FRQ may have you draw or analyze a chart or graph. Just watch out for that. The Research Method FRQ may have terms from other units. It may not just be terms from the research method unit. So just heads up on that. Know your different approaches to psychology. So you have like your behavioral approach, the humanistic approach, the biological approach. Know those things. They could probably have gone in our top 50 terms, but it's important to know those things as well. Let's see. Don't cram. Don't wait till the last minute, and get a good night's sleep and eat a good breakfast. Don't wait till the last minute, guys. You got it.